To mention few: forced evacuation, collective punishment, use of white phosphorus on civilians, destruction of religious sites and hospitals, and more. But before we tackle, contextualize, and educate one another on these issues, I would like to thank the members of the organization committee, my colleagues who have contributed in so many different ways, side by side. And I name Sabal Shawa, Silvia Maritano, Elena Nalato, Teresa Del Vecchio, Israel Maddah, Andrea Tafuri, Giuliana Rotola, Lorenzo Zannini, Lilia Dahl, and Rabia Ali. And especially our PhD coordinator, Mario Martina, and the communication team led by Marcello Arosio for supporting this initiative from its beginning. But most importantly, I would like to thank our honored guests, the speakers, for accepting our invitation to take part of this educational event and share their expertise in geopolitics, human rights, sustainability, and international law. The next 3 hours will be dedicated to 4 sessions, as mentioned in the program, moderated by the journalist Alba Nabulsi. Thank you, Alba, and welcome. Each of them will be followed by a Q&A session, joining both Alba and Saba. Please make sure to write your questions and curiosities in the Q&A box, and also communicate your comments in the chat. I also invite you all to stay tuned for the last special session, joining Alba and Silvia with Paola Rivetti for the role of academia, dedicated to an interactive discussion among us, the audience, and the speakers. We will be sharing different poll questions to have your feedback and voice your opinions as well. It is important to note that this workshop is being recorded and broadcast live on our official YouTube channel. Please check the link on our chat. And well, starting off our workshop by introducing our PhD SDC coordinator, Professor Mario Martina, for his welcoming word. Thank you, everyone. And Mario, prego.
Thank you, Hiba. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. Let me first thank all the invited speakers for their availability to share their knowledge and experience. I want to thank all the attendees that have shown their great interest on this subject. Currently, there are 170 persons connected on Zoom and many others on YouTube. And let me also thank again all the organizers: Hiba, Lilia, Teresa, Ezra, Saba, Silvia, Elena, Giuliana, Andrea, Lorenzo, and many others. I didn't mention the surname because Hiba already did, for their great work for organizing this important workshop. I think this workshop is an important milestone of our doctoral program, of which one of the aims is to work to the achievement of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals by UN agenda. And these not only by doing good quality research, but also to contribute and to participate by participating into the decision-making processes, into the policy-making processes of our society. I think this workshop is an example of the initiative that we can pursue in this direction. This initiative was a test for our community, for our capability to manage the decision process and the communication process about such a complex and very sensitive subject. We are all aware about how this subject is complex and sensitive. The PhD candidates, the organizers, showed the maturity and the tenacity in driving forward this initiative with a very low support from us, from the faculty. I hope the workshop serves as an opportunity for an in-depth discussion, a dialogue, providing a platform for the diverse perspective on the matter, on the subject, without causing offenses to anyone's sensibility. The opinions expressed in this workshop represent the results of personal studies, of reflections and experiences of all the speakers we will talk, and do not constitute the official stance of our doctoral program. There is not an official stance because we are all working to understand better this complex matter and subject. However, it is upon these information, opinions, that the discussion, which is fundamental, the fundamental prerequisite for doing good research, for having knowledge, and then for acting, upon these opinions and this information, we build our knowledge. I really thank again the organizer, and I let now Saba continue the introduction to this workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Hiba, for the introduction. My name is Sahba El-Shawa. I'm one of the PhD candidates in the Sustainable Development Climate Change Program. I'm also a Palestinian, and so it really is my honor and I believe responsibility to be here today to share with you more about what is happening in Gaza, but also to contextualize it within the larger struggle that Palestinians have been facing for decades. I want to first start by talking about our PhD ceasefire statement, which was also a student-led initiative that started back in November and was published in December with 126 of the PhD SDC students signing and endorsing a statement calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. In this statement, we echoed calls from United Nations agencies, including the UN Secretary General, who 70 days ago described Gaza as becoming a graveyard for children, 70 days ago. And since the publication of this statement and the first calls for a ceasefire around the world, the situation has only grown more and more dire every single day. Yesterday marked 100 days since the beginning of this assault on Gaza. In 100 days, 23,700 people have been killed, including 9,600 children. That is 1% of the entire population of Gaza. Thousands more remain missing and are presumed dead under the rubble, with no ability to extract their bodies, to give them a proper burial, or to even let their families know that they have been found. Over 60,000 people have been injured, and these are not minor injuries. We often forget to mention how many people have been injured. These are serious injuries, loss of limbs, loss of eyesight, severe burns, and more than 10 children per day lose their limbs. 2.2 million people are being starved, suffering crisis levels of food insecurity. 90% of the people in Gaza go 24 hours or more without any food. In the past 100 days, over 72 journalists and media workers have been killed. 136 UN workers have been killed, and over 300 medical professionals have been killed, all of whom hold a protected status under international law. In the past 100 days, 1.9 million people have been internally displaced. That is more than 80% of the people in Gaza. 359,000 housing units have been damaged or destroyed. 60% of the homes in Gaza have been lost. I want to take a moment to humanize these numbers when Palestinians are very often dehumanized by sharing a bit about my family. My entire dad's side of the family is from Gaza. My dad was born in Gaza, and every generation of his family before him was born in Gaza. These pictures that you see here are of my great-grandfather, my grandfather as a baby, my grandparents getting married in Gaza, and my father as a child as well. Every number that you just heard is more than just a number. Every number is a person with family and loved ones and dreams and goals for the future that will never materialize. In our extended family alone, we have lost over 70 family members in the past 100 days, the youngest of whom was a baby, not even 1 year old. And the oldest was 87 years old, an elder of the family who is older than the state of Israel. Today happens to be Martin Luther King Jr. Day. This was not planned when we picked this date, but I do believe to some extent it is fate that we get to reflect on what is happening today on this day. And I wanted to share a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." In its essence, this quote is telling us not to remain neutral. In the words of Desmond Tutu, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. When we witness injustices happening and we choose to remain silent, that is violence in and of itself. And so I hope that you reflect on this as we present various topics today to try and contextualize the injustice that Palestinians are facing in Gaza, to remember that not taking sides is not choosing peace. Today, we're going to talk about 4 topics: the historical context, the human rights, sustainability, and the role of academia. I will start first by giving some context to the historical context. The history of Gaza and Palestine as a whole cannot be understood without the context of European colonial history and awareness of the Western narrative bias. We are here as majority of us are students in an Italian PhD program. We are mostly subjected to European narratives and versions of history. And it's really important to be aware that this is often a one-sided version of history. I also wanted to stress this in terms of the role of the media. One very prominent example and relevant right now is with the International Court of Justice case where South Africa has charged Israel with genocide. And this happened on Thursday and Friday of last week. However, on major Western media channels, most of them did not even broadcast the day when South Africa presented its case, but they only broadcasted the Israeli side. So a lot of people are literally just being exposed to one side of the story. In talking about Zionism, political Zionism was established as a European settler colonial project, founded by the father of modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl. This is how they described it in the early days of modern Zionism. It was driven by Orientalist views and geopolitical interests. Herzl promised that for Europe, we would be the advanced post of civilization against barbarism. In essence, he agreed that Israel would act as an arm for European imperialism in the Middle East against the quote-unquote barbaric Arabs. Early Zionist leaders also described Palestine as a land without a people for a people without a land. This is a common trope that is often regurgitated by many leaders around the world. They argued at the time that the establishment of a Jewish state was the only way to end anti-Semitic persecution in Europe. However, they sought to establish it in a state that was already inhabited by the Palestinians. And in fact, Palestine was not the only country that was considered by early Zionists. And it's important to note that all of these colonial projects, by default, needed to displace the native population so that they can be so that those countries can then be inhabited by another population. And so, aided by Britain, Israel was born out of the colonization of Palestine and within the framework of European imperialist policies. Britain began to occupy Palestine in 1917, and it provided Zionists with strong army support. In 1917, they passed the Balfour Declaration, which recommended the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. During the British Mandate, large-scale Jewish immigration occurred, mainly from Eastern Europe, and the numbers obviously increased to much greater heights during the 1930s with the Nazi persecution of the Jews in Europe. And so the vast majority of all Jewish immigrants to Palestine between these years were European or Ashkenazi Jews, while Jews of Mizrahi or Arab descent faced new levels of persecution. It is important to note that in Palestine, there were Palestinian Jews. In the region, there were Arab Jews. And in fact, the establishment of a Zionist state caused a rise in anti-Semitism, effectively projecting what is more a European problem of anti-Semitism throughout the decades onto the native population in the region. Most of us know the context starting from the United Nations partition plan, when the UN decided to split Palestine into two states in 1947. The Nakba, which is Arabic for catastrophe, refers to when between 1947 and 1949, more than 750,000 Palestinians and the grand majority of the indigenous Palestinian population were expelled from their lands by Zionists. And as Israelis celebrate their Independence Day every year, Palestinians commemorate the Nakba. For Palestinians today, the Nakba is ongoing. We see very clearly in how these images in 2023 from Gaza echo the images from 1948 of Palestinians being forced to leave their homes. I will now talk about the human rights section and what key human rights issues and laws are relevant to Palestine and Gaza. Ironically, the same year that the Nakba happened in 1948, so was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted. The very next day, the UN General Assembly also adopted Resolution 194, which reaffirms the right of return of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons, and it has yet to be implemented. Despite this being a violation of humanitarian law in the Geneva Conventions, and both a war crime and a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute, the forcible transfer of Palestinians remains one of the main pillars of the Zionist project. And again, we see this echoed from 1948 to 2023 in what we are seeing right now in Gaza. In 1975, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution determining that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. This resolution was later revoked following political pressure from the United States and Israel. Many UN resolutions have since been adopted but not implemented, and the most recent being the UN General Resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, which was voted in with 153 countries in favor. However, UN General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding. The only legally binding resolutions would come out of the UN Security Council. Israel enjoys complete impunity at the UN Security Council because of the United States' power to veto any resolution that may cause it to stop its bombardment of Gaza. In finishing up the intro to this section, I wanted to introduce some key words and their definition. These are words that we often hear, but maybe don't reflect on what they actually mean. The first is terrorism, which is the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. I invite you all to reflect on when this word is used and who it applies to. The second is collective punishment, a form of sanction imposed on persons of a group in response to a crime committed by a member of that group. This is illegal under international law. Forced displacement is an involuntary or coerced movement of a person or people away from their home or region. Ethnic cleansing, rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove from a given area persons of another ethnic or religious group. And finally, genocide, a crime committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part. And as I mentioned, South Africa has taken Israel to the International Court of Justice for genocide in Gaza. This will be discussed by one of our speakers later. I will now talk about the third portion of our event today, which is sustainability. And it is one that obviously is very important to us as part of the PhD SDC program. I first want to stress that environmental impacts are not just about climate change. It also includes biodiversity loss, overconsumption of resources, all of which are impacted by military activities, which accelerate the climate change and lead directly to the destruction of biodiversity and resource consumption. True sustainability is intersectional. The UN Sustainable Development Goals that most of us work on don't only focus on environmental sustainability. In fact, in our ceasefire statement that was published in December, we highlighted almost every single SDG as being impacted in Gaza, including poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality, clean water, clean energy, economic growth, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities, and of course, peace, justice, and strong institutions. But that does not mean that the other SDGs are not also affected by this. I will be presenting in the sustainability section later, so I will talk more about that then in the context of Gaza. However, I do urge everyone to really reflect on this fact that sustainability is intersectional and these SDGs are all connected. Finally, we will have a discussion on the role of academia. So in reflecting on this, I wanted to highlight some examples of limitations of academic freedom in the West. The first is Adania Shibli, who is a Palestinian writer. She was supposed to be awarded at the Frankfurt Book Fair for her work in Germany. And this award ceremony was canceled due to her views as a Palestinian. It's really important to stress here that Germany does have a huge problem with anti-Palestinian sentiments. It is often that their guilt over the Holocaust is projected onto Palestinians who are suffering because of a genocide that they did not commit. The second, and a very prominent example that happened recently, was Claudine Gay, who was president of Harvard University in the United States. She was retaliated against by the Zionist lobbies in the US for not condemning pro-Palestine protests or slogans used on campus, and subsequently had to resign. As much as we have certain limitations to academic freedom in the West, this does not even compare to the level of retaliation against pro-Palestinian academics in Israel. On Israeli campuses, Palestinian and left-wing Jewish students and faculty have been suspended, arrested, and intimidated for their views since October 7. Israeli academics have also been jailed for criticizing actions of the Israeli army in Gaza, and campaigns of arrest have been launched by the occupation in the West Bank. These arrests and retaliations are part of a systemic suppression of pro-Palestinian voices, with a pattern of labeling them as anti-Semitic or even terrorist sympathizers to justify the violent censorship against them. And so what we will try to discuss is where does this academic freedom end, and how can it be used to make a difference? On this note, I do want to thank our PhD program, and especially our PhD coordinator, Mario Martina, for their support and encouragement in allowing us to use the PhD SDC platform to educate and to share more information about what's happening in Gaza. So with that, I will now hand it off to the moderator of our speaker sessions, who will be introducing our upcoming talks and speakers. Alba Nabulsi, who is a political scientist and gender issues expert. She serves as an educator, journalist, translator, and university researcher. Having graduated with a degree in gender studies, she obtained 2 specializations, one in the management of local development networks and another in urban regeneration and social innovation. She has previously conducted research at the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Padua and collaborated with the Ministry of Social Policies and Equal Opportunities, as well as with various NGOs on issues related to participation, local development, gender, and social inclusion and diversity. As a journalist, she collaborates with various national and international outlets. With that, I will hand it over to Alba to introduce our next session and our first speaker.
Hi, can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be part of this workshop, and I thank Sahba and all the PhD members for inviting me. It is with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce the first panel on the historical context. So we are going to listen to Atwa Jaber. She's going to talk about, he's going to talk, about forced displacement and resilience in Gaza, a history within a history. Let me introduce Atwa. He's a PhD candidate in international history and politics at the Geneva Graduate Institute and a research fellow at the Institute for Palestine Studies. His doctoral research examines the geographies and histories of forced displacement in Palestine, with a particular focus on the 67 occupation of the Jordan Valley. So I'll leave the floor to Atwa.
Thank you, Alba, for the introduction, and thank you all for organizing this very important workshop. And especially thank you, Sahba, for the also very important historical background which you provided, which is very important to understand the present reality in Gaza. And I will start by sharing my screen. Can you see it? Yes. So I will.
Sorry, Atwa. We were seeing the screen. Yeah, now we see it very well.
We see it.
Now you don't?
Yes.
Perfectly.
Yes.
Okay.
We can see it that way. You can go ahead.
Yes, but now you can't see it.
No, we can. Yes.
You can?
It's good. It's
Yes,
good. Yes.
it's good.
Okay, perfect. So I will provide a similar historical background, but with a more focus on the Gaza Strip. So 101 days have passed since Israel waged its genocidal war on Gaza. Israel's bombardment campaign and its ground military operation have killed indiscriminately more than 23,000 Palestinian men, women, and children. And at least 8,000 Palestinians remain missing under the rubble. And equally important, 1.9 million Palestinians are displaced, mostly from the north and the center to the south of the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, Israeli settlers and military forces have killed over 300 Palestinians and imprisoned over 2,000 more. Palestinian prisoners behind Israeli bars are facing some of the most brutal conditions they have witnessed in years, a campaign of collective punishment, torture, and death. And inside Israel, Palestinians are also being targeted with a violent campaign of surveillance, silencing, and detention. Therefore, what may have started on the 7th of October as a fanatic reaction to the Al-Aqsa flood operation is now an intensification of the ongoing erasure against Palestinians all over Palestine. With a focus on mass displacement and resilience of Palestinians in Gaza, my intervention will highlight key moments in which Palestinians, specifically in Gaza, have experienced displacement and dispossession under Israel's settler colonialism. And this is to approach the present reality with an eye on the past in order to understand more thoroughly how history has shaped the present reality in Gaza. So what we now call the Gaza Strip has an area of 361 square kilometers and is home to 2.1 million Palestinians, 81% of whom are refugees. During the British Mandate, the Gaza Strip, alongside what we know today as the Gaza Strip, alongside the area of Bir al-Saba, formed the Gaza District. That's the Mandate District of Gaza, which was one of the 5 districts in Mandate Palestine. At the time, the population of Gaza was 80,000 Palestinians, mostly in the city of Gaza. The current trend of forced displacement towards Palestinians in the Gaza Strip has its roots right after the British Mandates, precisely 76 years ago, following the onset of the Nakba in 1948. During the Nakba, which marked the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the Zionist militias displaced 750,000 of the native Palestinians, destroyed 500 of their villages, and depopulated several Palestinian urban neighborhoods across Mandate Palestine. What did this mean for Gaza? In the Gaza district, the Zionists ethnically cleansed Bir al-Saba area, where they destroyed 49 Palestinian villages and forcibly displaced the residents, most of whom ended up in and around the city of Gaza as refugees. This refugee population at the time exceeded 200,000 Palestinians, including refugees from the depopulated city of Lid, so mostly came from the center and the south of Mandate Palestine. In the Gaza at the time, the American Friends Services Committee was mandated by the UN to provide aid to the refugees, as opposed to the ICRC mandate to do the same in the West Bank. And the AFSC established 8 refugee camps, which UNRWA took in the beginning of 1950 when it started its operations. And I will mention those camps by name: Jabalia, Ansirat, Al-Maghazi, Deir al-Balah, Khan Yunis, Rafah, Al-Shati, Al-Bridge. And you've heard most probably the names of all of these camps in the past 101 days, as all of them have been attacked and bombarded by Israel. So this means that 75 years ago, the vast majority of the Gaza population settled in Gaza by force upon their catastrophe. And this established Gaza early on as a site of resistance against Zionist projects of territorial dispossession, Palestinians' struggle for liberation and decolonization, and also as a site for continued struggle against Israel's displacement policies. Soon after the settlement of the Nakba refugees in the Gaza Strip, Israel began an organized campaign to displace them yet again, either in whole or in part. In fact, projects to resettle the Gaza refugees started as early as 1951 under the pressure of UNRWA from the United States. During that year, around 2,500 Palestinian refugees were resettled to Libya, and in 1952, 12,000 more refugees from Gaza were resettled into Sinai. In 1955, massive popular mobilization against these resettlement projects emerged in Gaza, then under Egyptian military rule, of course. The refugees revolted and threatened to take up arms against the resettlement plans. Jamal Abdel Nasser was forced at the time to suspend these resettlement plans, and this was a significant moment for Gaza and for the Nakba refugees as a whole, because the refugees became a symbol of political struggle rather than a mere humanitarian issue, and this started in Gaza. Fast forward to 1967, when Israel defeated the Arab armies and occupied the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. In Gaza, since day one of the Israeli occupation, Israel led a violent campaign to oppress the Palestinians, the vast majority of which were refugees in the densely populated camps. This materialized in violent policies of detentions, curfews, demolitions, and interrogations. The Israeli occupation of Gaza marked another wave of mass displacement for Palestinians from the Strip. So at the time, Israel displaced 13,000 Palestinians to Egypt, and 45,000 Palestinians fled from Gaza to the West Bank amidst the war, most of whom ended up in Jericho and then crossed to the east bank of the Jordan River, and they still remain in Jordan with their descendants. With that in mind, in 1967, since 1967, Israel became a cradle for various forms of resistance against the Israeli military occupation, which Israel confronted with more organized violence. Ariel Sharon, then the Israeli military commander of the southern region, led an outrageous campaign in the years 1970 and 1971 to isolate Gaza, imposing a strong grip of the military rule, which casted its shadows on the refugee camps. Sharon restructured the geography of the Gaza Strip, bombing thousands of houses, especially in the refugee camps, from which 35,000 more Nakba refugees were uprooted yet again and displaced to areas outside the camps. This included 16,000 refugees who were forcibly displaced outside the Gaza Strip, including the collective punishment of 12,000 Palestinians from families of the Fidaiyin, the Palestinian freedom fighters, whom Israel also displaced to Sinai. This campaign of what was called dissolving the refugee camps in Gaza continued between the years 1972 and the late 1980s, entailing plans to relocate 62,000 of the Gaza refugees to other urban cities and sites across the Gaza Strip. There were organized demolitions, creating wider roads, etc. So this, Israel perceived, would allow more control of the densely populated refugee camps, which were and probably still are Israel's worst strategic nightmare. In 1987, the first Intifada broke out in the Gaza Strip, precisely in Jabalia refugee camp. At the time, a generation of Gazans had no other memory but that of brutal military occupation, oppression, and displacement. The refugee camps became once again a cradle for resistance, and the Intifada spread all over occupied Palestine. Here it is worth mentioning that around the same time, Hamas emerged as a key player in the Palestinian arena. Israel, now determined to eliminate Hamas under any possible costs today, viewed Hamas at the time as an asset, a way to radicalize the Palestinian liberation movement, which in itself is an entire history that we can touch upon in the Q&A, or maybe I can suggest some readings on this later. But let's fast forward again to the years from 1993 to 1995, the signing of the Oslo Accords and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. In the Gaza Strip, not much changed for the political and administrative reality of the Palestinian population. The majority of them still being registered refugees, they continued to receive most of their basic services, including education, healthcare, vocational training, etc., from UNRWA. And this is a reality which continued for the following years, and we can still see today to a very large extent. We fast forward to 2005, following the second Intifada, another important moment for Gaza. Gaza became a true nightmare for Israel by the time, where the cost of maintaining the direct military occupation and the settlements became too high to bear. Ariel Sharon, then he became Israel's prime minister, deployed all the settlers, the Israeli settlers from the Gaza Strip, a bit more than 8,000, and this happened in tandem with the construction of the apartheid separation wall in the West Bank, where Israel's control, on the contrary, was being intensified, including the expansion of the illegal settlements. So now seen as a liability, Israel's new policy towards Gaza became isolation, especially from the West Bank, and viewing Gaza more and more as Egypt's problem. At that point in time, a link to the present was Netanyahu's resignation from Sharon's government. He joined the movement of enraged settlers who believed that, quote, Jews do not expel Jews, end quote. Today, under Netanyahu's leadership of the war, A number of these evacuated settlers are in positions of power, calling for full Israeli control and resettlement in a depopulated Gaza Strip. Then in 2006, the world called for a Palestinian election. The world did not like the results. Hamas won, and they were not allowed to rule, neither in the West Bank nor in Gaza, but they soon assumed control over the Gaza Strip. And since 2007, the blockade on Gaza intensified. So did the severance of Gaza from the West Bank, where the PA control under Fatah was solidified by Israel and the so-called West. In following years, Israel took another step in the intensification of this violent siege over Gaza, creating gradually what the United Nations later called an uninhabitable environment. This reality, which we see clearly today, has been entrenched not only with a suffocating siege, but also with direct brutal force, manifest in the consecutive wars which Israel waged on Gaza in the last 2 decades. In 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021, and now in 2023, Israel became a target for brutal Israeli military campaigns, a laboratory for lethal techniques of killings, and now the subject of yet another organized campaign of forced mass displacement. In the past months, Israel's plans to displace the majority of Palestinians and re-establish its military and settlement presence in the Gaza Strip have become louder than ever. Even if these plans do not materialize in reality, they signify the essence of Israel's Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. The true complement for the formation and the survival of the settler society is the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And this has been the case since 1948, and we see it now today again in 2023. So any serious discussions of Palestinians' displacement, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, whether in the past or the present, must be viewed within this paradigm. I will stop here, and I'm happy to discuss everything I mentioned more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your intervention. So next intervention will be a recorded one. We have a contribution from Shireen Seikali from the University of California, Santa Barbara. The title of the intervention will be Can we talk about Palestine on life? Shireen Seikali is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her book, Man of Capital, Scarcity and Economy in Mandate Palestine, edited by Stanford University Press, explores economy, territory, the home, and the body. Her forthcoming book, From Baltimore to Beirut, on the question of Palestine, tells the global history of capital, slavery, and dispossession. She is the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at UCSB, co-editor of the Stanford Studies, Middle Eastern and Islamic Societies and Culture series, co-editor of Journal of Palestine Studies, and co-editor of Jadaliyya.
We've pre-recorded this. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me with you at this conference. We've pre-recorded this talk because I am in California and I could not join you in person. Thank you again to the organizers. My talk today is titled, Can We Talk About Palestine? I am with you today, the daughter of refugees who survived the Nakba of 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians became stateless refugees, when 150,000 Palestinians were rendered strangers, subject to military rule, and now a quote-unquote minority on their own lands. It is my inheritance to talk about Palestine. I am with you today, an historian of Palestine. It is my job to talk about Palestine. I am with you today, a small part of a large movement, a movement of people with the courage to utter words like free, Palestine, river, and sea, a global movement that has taken the streets as we witness a devastating war of annihilation on Palestine, on Palestinians, on the very idea of our peoplehood. A movement that confronts powerful forces trying to silence us, from the floor of the United States Congress to the ruins of the Gaza Central Archive, shattered under the force of the fourth largest army in the world. In keeping with a long, honorable tradition of Jewish anti-Zionism, organizations such as Jewish Voice for Peace and Not in Our Name remind us today that defending Palestinian rights, criticizing Israeli policy, and opposing anti-Semitism are wholly consistent positions to hold. Multiple strategies for liberation and multiple struggles for liberation have taught us that to stand for Palestine is to stand against all forms of racism and oppression. They have taught us that no one is free until we are all free. I honor these lessons in offering 4 ways to talk about Palestine: to listen, to witness, to remember, and to speak. Let us witness. Early on in these 100 days that have lasted a lifetime, the content creator turned reporter Bisan Auda began her reel as she did every day. I am Bisan from Gaza, Palestine. We are still alive. That day, on October 18, her cheeks were fuller than they are today, her eyes still sparkling with an anticipation now worn down by an unsatiable grief, by witnessing lives lost, dreams annihilated. She said, "I want to show you how good people are." A group of young Mun bakers had started a free bakery in the Shifa courtyard, using what dwindling supplies they had to feed one another. Khubz Arabi, or Arabic bread, is slightly leavened flatbread. It has 5 ingredients: flour, water, sugar, yeast, and salt. It has many permutations. It responds to the conditions around it. It requires care, dexterity, and resourcefulness. Palestinian bakeries, like Palestinian hospitals, have been a recurring target of this war of annihilation. Among the thousands of lives ruined and maimed lie the remnants of the places that fed them. On October 25, 2023, Oxfam declared starvation had become a key weapon of the war on Gaza. 2.3 million people had at that point access to 2% of the supplies that they needed. That day, on October 18, Bisan stood in the courtyard of the hospital, transformed from a house of healing to a place of refuge, to a mass burial site, to a site of siege. That day, Bisan explained, "We craft hope, even if we will not live to see tomorrow." Catastrophe is not in the future. The Nakba is not in the past. Let us listen. A young girl narrates. She is 7 or 8. Her hair is singed, her brown eyes are wide, her clothes are melted, her hands are burned, her face is layered with dust, yellow powder, and blood. She is composed, confident. It is the 12th of November, 2023. She begins, "We went to Shifa. We learned it was a target. My mother wanted to go to her cousins. They were sheltering at another hospital." Her story continues. "We found a room. We took shelter. The tanks were at the gate." Her voice rises. Emotion fills her throat. "We were asleep when the bombing started. The sound did not wake me. The smoke did." She does not shake. She does not cry. She is calm, pragmatic, matter of fact. She tells her story as a cautionary tale. And still so much escapes words. What did she see that day at Shifa? Did she see the wounded and the displaced crowded into hallways and staircases? Did the smell of death envelop her? Did the reality of decomposing bodies confront her? Did she walk the packed corridors? Did she glimpse the women sitting on stools, making life in the midst of catastrophe? Did she take comfort from the woman with the two-tiered electric ovens, kneading dough, putting it on the fire, watching it rise, browning the loaf, filling hungry stomachs with what little supplies were left. Did she get a piece of bread? Let us remember. Let us remember on this 100th day of 75 years of Nakba and 100 years of war, 100 years of denial of Palestinian political rights and peoplehood. Let us remember November 29, 1947, when the General Assembly of the newly established United Nations voted to terminate the British mandate and partition Palestine into an Arab and a Jewish state. Let us remember the many dates since then. Between November 1947 and May 1948, Zionist forces and the Palestinians were immersed in a war for the future. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the State of Israel. The next day, the armies of Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, and Iraq invaded. The Nakba of 1948 took place in what historians now categorize as 4 stages. Stage 1 was from December 1947 to March 1948. The Zionist military organization, the Haganah, shelled neighborhoods and villages and authorized the destruction and expulsion of the villages of Arab Suqair and Kisaria, south of Haifa, in February 1948. 2 militias, the Irgun and the Lehi, targeted Arab fighters and Palestinian civilians at bus stops, shopping centers, and markets. The Haganah's military advances and psychological warfare marked this period as one of panic and fear. During these 4 months, Palestinians with the means to do so fled in hopes of return. Stage 2 began in March 1948 when Plan Dalit was dispatched to Haganah forces. This plan was a shift to large-scale, highly organized, and sustained operations. The war of conquest was in full force. On April 9, 1948, paramilitary forces, the Irgun and the Lehi, numbering about 120 troopers, advanced on a village near Jerusalem called Deir Yassin. The troopers pillaged the village, shot fleeing civilians, and killed 100 to 120 villagers, including combatants. Later that month, the Haganah overpowered Arab forces in Haifa. By May 1948, expulsion of villagers had become regular practice. By the end of June, 250,000 Palestinians had fled or been expelled under the force of fire. Stage 3 of the Nakba was between July and October 1948. That July, Israeli forces expelled 60,000 Palestinians, men and women, children and the elderly, from the towns of Lidda and Ramla, southeast of Jaffa. The refugee columns left behind a trail of belongings. Some refugees perished along the way. Stage 4 of the Nakba was between October 1948 and March 1949, when Israeli forces conquered the Nakab, the Jerusalem Corridor, and the Upper Galilee. In December 1948, Israel issued the emergency regulations on the property of absentees, later embodied in law. This emergency legislation facilitated the expropriation of the land and property of Palestinian refugees. By the end of the Nakba, Israeli forces had destroyed 470 to 530 Palestinian villages and emptied Palestinian cities and neighborhoods. Looting, massacres, and imprisonment prevailed. Let us witness. Let us witness the Palestinian condition. Separation, subjection to premature death, colonization, brutality, necropolitics, borders that cross and define you, the constant threat, erasure, and denial of rights to basic politics and peoplehood, a suffocating subjugation. The Nakba has never stopped. It is now in full-scale assault. Today we rehearse another inventory. Since October 7, every day we grieve lost lives. We grieve the loss of 1,200 Israelis. We grieve the 23 1,968 Palestinians, including 10,000 children that we have lost. We grieve the thousands missing under the rubble. We grieve as more than 2 million of Gaza's 2.3 million Palestinians are now officially internally displaced persons. The grief overwhelms us, and yet we hold on to it. We hold on to the children, rocked by pain, crumpled in their heartbreak over their dead parents. We hold on to the parents, devastated, unable to let go of their dead children. We know, as Hala Alian teaches us, that bearing witness is an honor, that we owe these Palestinians our endurance. The UN warns of a risk of genocide against Palestinians, but we do not have time for these warnings. We cannot await a secular salvation or a messianic apocalypse. We are in the apocalypse. From perpetual climate crisis to the extinction of plants and animals, to the forces of white supremacy, misogyny, and global fascism, we live in a world of generalized catastrophe, in a condition of trouble without end, of transit, in the wake of interminable events. In this age, Palestine is a paradigm. It can teach us about our present condition of the permanent temporary. Palestine is a place of abundance, an abundance of lessons about persisting in the present. Like many other struggles, Palestine reminds us, in the words of Jody Bird, that the post has not yet arrived. There is no post-colonial, post-racial, or post-Zionist. As we listen, witness, remember, and speak apocalypse, we hold tightly to the lessons that the keeper of families and the keepers of stories teach us: to bake bread, to tell your story. It is these acts to which we return. Let us speak. Crisis and speech, we have learned from Rosemary Sayegh, are inextricable. Crisis is motive, content, and structure of speech. The stories of everyday people witnessing extraordinary things are based on experience. They are non-chronological and fragmented. They exceed geopolitical plots. Those storytellers, they do not reflect history, they make it. We must listen to these embodied polyvocal testimonies of storytellers like Bisan. They are as old as Palestine itself. And these stories are not, as Hannah Sleiman reminds us, only a register of resilience, steadfastness, and hope. They are also cautionary tales. The teller of these tales are calm, pragmatic, matter of fact. They know that the worst is yet to come because the worst has never stopped. Palestinian storytellers offer a set of tools, skills, and mindsets. They shape a historiographic form, a way of telling history. In this 100th day of 75 years of Nakba and 100 years of war, there is a raid every half hour. A Palestinian child dies every 10 minutes. Palestine is the place where a world is unmade, a world where the illusions of international law, humanitarianism, and the claims of civilization shatter ever further into an inferno of hypocrisies and lies. Today, amidst genocide, we follow the lessons of the bakers and the storytellers, kneading dough, crafting narratives, making worlds, even as they face the certainty of their death. I am smiling, Bisan says, because I love life, because I am still alive.
Thank you so much for this other intervention. We have several questions coming up for Atwa. I would start from one question that we got in the Q&A box. I would start by we have many, so let me choose. First of all, someone asked what is Hamas from an historical context, but also from a human rights point of view. So it's not directly linked to the presentation itself, I mean, but feel free to to answer. And also, I think another interesting question would be, how does the Palestinian experience of displacement compare to the other major displacement crisis in Italy? Like a bit of a comparative a study, if you can help us putting the Palestinian issue in context. So I'll leave it to you for the discussion. So I repeat, the first question was about what is Hamas, both historically and under human rights perspective, and how does the Palestinian experience of displacement compare to other major displacement crises? Thank you.
Thank you, Alba. How much time do we have until the end of the session for answering questions?
Actually, if you can make it in like we have until 3:40, so it's like about
Okay.
7 minutes.
Yeah, I'll do my best. And unfortunately, Shireen is not here with us, but I'll try also to address anything related to her presentation. So what is Hamas? I mean, that's, like I said, that's a very complex history. But in a nutshell, Hamas, the roots of Hamas started in Gaza, and the roots of Hamas stem from the movement of the Muslim Brotherhood, basically, the 1940s, 50s. And then in the 1960s and 70s, under the leadership of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was the former head of Hamas, whom Israel assassinated later, he started establishing some organizations in Gaza that served as the basis for the then in 1987 the launching and establishment of Hamas with his group of Muslim brothers. And in a historical and human rights point of view, that's a bit hard to tackle, but I can say from a social point of view, at the time, since the very beginnings, Hamas had been rooted deeply within the Palestinian society in Gaza. Like I said, they started as grassroots organizations working with youth, elderly, etc., and then slowly took on a political path, which then adapted the armed resistance for the liberation of Palestine path. So there was also the establishment of the military branch of Hamas, or what we know today as the Qassam brigades. But then again, I can share key readings about this if the students in the audience are interested. I'll be happy to share a few articles and books specifically on this historical background. I think the second question, Alba, which you asked me to answer, was about how does the Palestinian experience of displacement compare to other major displacement crises in history?
Exactly.
I think Shireen very carefully and thoroughly addressed this question in part in her presentation, at least touching upon one very important difference about this refugee crisis, which essentially stems from the fact that Palestinians were displaced at a time in history where the world was recognizing the human rights of all other people, or at least most of them. So that is one thing. And the second, that Palestinians, this burden of refugeehood and statelessness and ethnic cleansing at the time was put on the shoulders of Palestinians because as a solution to a problem of anti-Semitism, basically, that started in Europe and ended in Europe with the Holocaust against the Jewish population in Germany. So this is one thing. And the second thing is that for 75 years, this refugeehood has been protracted for a very long time. And what started as 750,000 Palestine refugees is now, according to the UNRWA records, has reached more than 5.5 million Palestine refugees, and those are the ones registered with UNRWA. There is an estimated another million who are not registered, so more than 6 million refugees. And this leads to a third point, in my opinion, which is the right of return. And this right of return is an idea that is deeply rooted in the Palestinian refugeehood crisis, which we can now see in the third and fourth generations. And it has played a role in forming the Palestinian identity, especially in exile. And I think this also touches upon a third question, if I'm not mistaken. We have 2 more minutes. I don't know if you want to address more.
So let me go through the questions. Somebody asked, what are the long-term implications of unresolved Palestinian displacement for regional stability?
So I can maybe talk a bit about the historical implications that can also tell us something about the present and maybe the future. So the Palestinian refugeehood is not, like I said in my presentation, it has been portrayed a lot as a humanitarian issue, but in its essence, as we saw in the 2 presentations, it is not. It is a very political issue that needs political action to be resolved. And if we talk about the Arab region, or at least the Middle East, those refugees have been displaced towards the neighboring Arab countries. And if we look at the history of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and even Egypt to a certain degree, we can see how the presence of Palestinian refugees there since 1948 has played a role in shaping not only the regional politics of these countries, but also the internal politics. If we look at Jordan in the 1970s, Black September and the clash with the PLO, if we look at Beirut, Lebanon in the 80s, and we look at the involvement of the PLO in the Lebanese civil war, and we see today, on the other hand, in Syria, how Palestinians, for example, in Yarmouk refugee camp, which was almost completely wiped off the face of earth, have faced the burden of what the Syrians themselves faced in their ongoing war in Syria. So there is definitely an implication of the Palestinian displacement crisis in the region, and I think this is one reason why the Egyptians and the Jordanians, especially since the very beginning of the ongoing war on Gaza, from the 8th or 9th of October, they have very loudly and clearly said, we will not take any Palestinian refugees in Egypt from Gaza and in Jordan from the West Bank, because they realize the implications of a third mass wave of displacement that would be not only for the Palestinians, the implications for Palestinians, but also for the implications on the host societies, meaning the neighboring Arab countries. But again, this is also a very intricate topic. I hope that I addressed it as much as possible in these few minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much also for respecting the timing perfectly. It was very precious to hear your intervention and your answers. So I'll introduce the second moment of this workshop, which is the one that revolves around legality and human rights. First of all, we have an intervention by Tommaso Natoli from the Italian Red Cross, titled The Gaza Conflict Through the Lens of International Humanitarian Law. And let me introduce Tommaso briefly. Tommaso sits in the IHL Operation Unit, which aims to support advocacy campaigns and activities for the dissemination of international humanitarian law and international disaster law, including through internal and external training and events, contributing to increasing the visibility, authority, and incisiveness of the ITRC in the national and international context. He also contributes to the development of an advocacy network in favor of the ITRC's mission and to the mobilization of the main actors in the field of humanitarian policies and IHL, and supports its bodies in the drafting of humanitarian policies and position papers, as well as in the management of the associations with the International Cross and Red Crescent movement. So thank you, Tommaso, for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Alba. Thanks to all the organizers for inviting me, also on behalf of the focal point of the Italian Red Cross on IHL issues. So my short speech will deal with international humanitarian law issues that could be taken into consideration in the ongoing Gaza conflict. Let me start by briefly illustrating the main idea, which is at the core of this presentation, which is that even if it's hard to believe, considering the events that are occurring these months, even in war, there are basic legal principles and rules that have to be respected. So the core of these rules was agreed originally by the international community at the end of the 19th century. And after that moment of origins of IHL, these rules evolved over time to follow the developments of means and methods of warfare. So the contemporary body of international law, which deals with these issues, which is called International Humanitarian Law, or IHL, is shaped around a few basic principles, all of which are based on the need to balance, on one side, military necessity of the parties, and on the other side, the need to respect for humanity. What does this mean? It means, for instance, to abide by a principle of distinction, which means that belligerent parties cannot attack civilians or civilian objects. It means that the impact of warfare on vulnerable categories as women or children has to be minimized. Detainees have to be treated humanly. Belligerent parties cannot torture people or provoke unnecessary suffering. This is just to give you an overall overview of main component of IHL. Another basic principle is that is the principle of proportionality, according to which IHL prohibits attacks that may be expected to cause excessive incidental civilian harm in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage, which can be anticipated. Or the principle of precaution, which refers to the fact that in the conduct of military operations, constant care must be taken to spare the civilian population and civilian objects, and all feasible precautions must be taken to avoid and in any event to minimize incidental loss of life, of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. So these principles inspired the development of a set of rules commonly known as IHL that seeks for humanitarian reasons to limit the effects of armed conflict. The 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 have been ratified today by all 196 states, making IHL a universal body of law, at least this part of IHL, the core treaties of IHL, a universal body of law. And then also the 2 additional protocols adopted in 1977 needs to be mentioned, as they provide additional provisions applicable respectively to non-international armed conflict and international armed conflict. So these constitute the core treaties of reference. Some of these rules also have gained a customary status, which means that bind all parties, regardless of their being signatories or having ratified those treaties. So to be a bit more specific, IHL protects persons who do not or no longer take part in the fighting, including civilians, medics, aid workers, wounded and sick, shipwrecked troops, prisoners of war, and or other detainees. But also IHL imposes limits on the means and methods of warfare, for instance, by limiting the use of certain weapons or prohibiting certain weapons at all. IHL applies only in situations of armed conflict. This is interesting because there is an interplay between the human rights body of law, which would be addressed by the next speaker, and international humanitarian law. So it is important to clarify that IHL is applicable only in situations of armed conflict and in connection with belligerent dynamics. There are two main systems of protection, one for international armed conflicts, which are armed conflicts among two or more states, and another set of rules, which on the contrary is applicable in non-international armed conflicts, which are armed conflicts involving governmental armed forces fighting against one or more non-state armed groups, or such groups fighting each other. And then there is the law of occupation, which is of particular interest for us today, which is a particular subgroup of IHL norms regulating the duties of belligerent parties that take control of a portion of territory previously under the jurisdiction of the opposite part, and also deals with the rights of the population living in that territory. A key actor that contributed to substantially to the creation and development of IHL, and it keeps contributing to its respect and application, is the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is generally referred to as the International Red Cross in the media, but the correct name is International Committee of the Red Cross, which is different from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and is not the same thing as the National Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. We can maybe come back to this point in the Q&A session if of interest to attendees and participants. Why the ICRC is particularly important? This is because the ICRC is an impartial, neutral, and independent organization whose exclusively humanitarian mission is to protect the lives and dignity of victims of war, to provide them with assistance. So it coordinates and conducts international relief and works, but also promotes and strengthens international humanitarian law and the universal humanitarian principles. So it's this neutrality, this character of neutrality and impartiality that allows the ICRC to enter directly in contact with belligerent parties, to put in place, let's say, advocacy effort to push these parties to respect IHL as far as possible. So the core task of the committee, the ICRC, which derives directly from the Geneva Conventions and the statutes, are those that you can see here listed in the slide. It is interesting to see that as part of the core tasks, we can find that of monitoring compliance of warring parties with the Geneva Conventions. The neutrality of the ICRC, let me say, is also the reason why in the images, when hostages were released, we saw ICRC delegates and officers operating as personnel that was facilitating and making it possible, exactly because they were in contact with both parties and were trusted by both. So this is a brief introduction of IHL for those of you who are not necessarily expert of what IHL is and what is the role of the ICRC. Let's try to frame this to what is happening in Gaza. I would like to mention some of the main issues relevant to IHL that can be identified in the situation. Let me first say that most of them are particularly challenging, even for IHL experts and scholars. So I will try to avoid excessive technicalities. We don't have time. This is not the right place to do that. I will try to picture the overall scenario of legality or illegality profiles and highlight only some of the issues that could be addressed in this specific context from an IHL perspective. So as we all know, the recent hostilities have had an immense impact on civilians. Thousands of people have been killed and injured. Hundreds of thousands are displaced. Families have lost homes. Around 200 people are still hostages. Basic essential needs are not met in Gaza. And with no end in sight, the level of pain and suffering is unimaginable. Is this an acceptable outcome or effect of a war from an IHL perspective? So there are mainly three aspects of relevance that can be considered at this regard in order to try to provide an answer to this question. The first one is related to the legal status of the Gaza Strip, and specifically on deciding if Gaza is a territory under military occupation or not, again, from an international humanitarian law perspective. Why it's important? Because this determines the potential applicability of those IHL rules regulating this situation, these kind of situations, belligerent occupations. So there are different positions on this point in the international community, but we can say that more than 160 states and the ICRC consider Palestinian territory to be occupied, even if Palestine cannot be considered as a state from a material perspective. The capacity to clearly identify the borders is one of the factual elements that, from an international perspective, create some challenges in terms of identifying Palestine as a state. And this is because, the fact that Gaza can be considered as an occupied territory, Palestine's statehood has no bearing on this legal determination. Belligerent occupation is a matter of fact. So a territory is considered occupied when it is placed under the authority of a hostile army. And since 1967, international armed conflict between Israel and its neighboring state that triggered the application of the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, the Palestinian territory has been under the authority of the Israeli army. And this position is based on the consideration that despite the decision to withdraw the physical presence of Israeli armed forces from the Strip, taken in 2005, Israel still exercises key elements of authority over this territory, including over its border, airspace, sea, and land, with the exception of the border with Egypt, as well as through the use of new technologies. So there are also the ongoing developments, but this is the majority. This is what the majority of this international community and the ICRC are maintaining in terms of the legal status. So according to this view, Israel continues to be bound by certain obligations under the law of occupation that are commensurate with the degree to which it exercises control over it. And there are specific rules on humanitarian assistance to be allowed in the occupied territories, rules that safeguard the demographic balance of the population in the occupied territories. There are rules that identify specific war crimes, which are serious violation of IHL, specifically in situation of occupations. And this leads us to the second issue I wanted to briefly touch, which concerned the duty to ensure civilian population with access to humanitarian assistance. So to put it simply, IHL framework governing humanitarian access consists of 3 interdependent layers, let's say. So the first one is that each party to an armed conflict has to meet the basic needs of the population under its control. Regardless of the qualification of the conflict, international, non-international occupation, the belligerent party that exercises effective control has the primary obligation to ensure and provide basic humanitarian assistance to the population and to its primary needs, so food, water, medicines, clothing, everything that is essential for the survival of civilians, including, for example, fuel. Second, impartial humanitarian organizations have the right to offer their services to carry out humanitarian activities, especially when the basic needs of the population are not met. If the belligerent party, so the one exercises control, does not have the will or the possibility to ensure the satisfaction of these needs, then it needs to consider the offers by humanitarian actors. Of course, the consent of the state or authority is necessary, but this consent cannot be denied for arbitrary reasons. And this is another element of interest. The third and last layer is that once impartial humanitarian relief schemes have been agreed to, the parties to the armed conflict, as well as all states that are not party to the conflict, are expected to allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of the relief schemes. At the same time, they may exercise...
I will ask you to try to finalize the presentation because we're slowly running out of time. So just wanted
it's around 13 minutes to on my clock, but I will try to wrap up and close in 2 minutes. Okay, so the third layer is related to the fact that, as I was saying, when these relief schemes have been agreed to, the state exercises control, has a right to control, to verify that the goods are in fact what they are claimed to be, and this includes the right to prescribe technical rules to regulate this passage, including inspections, the possibility of prescribing the routes and times of passage of humanitarian convoys, and other measures that prevent incoming humanitarian goods from being diverted from the population for which they are intended. So this is an important and relevant, let's say, legal technical counterbalance to the right to provide humanitarian assistance. The last point was related to what about respect for the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality. There are alleged cases in which one of the two sides is using hospitals and schools. That can be cases in which one of the two sides is using hospitals or schools as a base for military operations. Are those places then a legitimate military target under IHL? This is, of course, an element of great relevance. Let's say that IHL prohibit direct attacks on civilian objects like hospitals and schools. They also prohibit direct attacks against hospital and medical staff, which are specially protected under IHL. That said, hospitals or schools may become a legitimate military target if they contribute to specific military operations of the enemy, and if its destruction offers a definite military advantage for the attacking side. It is important to say on this point that if there is any doubt about the effective use and the military advantage coming from the attack, they cannot be attacked. Hospitals only lose their protection in certain circumstances. For example, if an hospital is being used as a base from which to launch an attack, as a weapons depot, or to hide healthy soldiers or fighters. And there are also certain conditions that regulates these possibilities. For instance, before a party to a conflict can respond to such attacks by attacking, it has to give a warning with a time limit, and the other party has to have ignored that warning. I will have a couple of conclusive remarks, but considering time, I will stop there, and I will leave it maybe the discussion about what happens if a state or individuals violate IHL to the Q&A session if of interest for the audience. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tommaso. You're more than welcome to add any interesting conclusion and reflection at the Q&A time. Thank you so much for your presentation. And moving on, we have Michael Link next. The subject of his intervention will be Gaza, Israel, and the demands of international law. Michael is from the Western University of Ontario, and he is the former United Nations Special Rapporteur for the Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. During his 6 years as Special Rapporteur, he regularly addressed the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva and the Third Committee of the United Nations General Assembly in New York. He is currently an Associate Professor of Law at Western University in London, Ontario, Canada, where he teaches labor law, constitutional law, and human rights law. So, Michael, welcome to the panel.
Thank you very much. Are you able to see my screen?
We are.
Okay. I'm going to speak very briefly today, both about some of the background with respect to international law as it has affected the conflicts in Gaza, as well as the current case with respect to the application to the International Criminal Court on genocide by South Africa. Okay, and can you see my new slide? I just want to make sure that this is working.
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we've had a series of Israeli wars on Gaza over the last 15 years. The main ones that occurred were in the years that I've noted. The big ones were in 2008, 2009, again in 2014, and again during the Great March of Return in 2018. And on each of those three occasions of those particular conflicts and wars that I mentioned, the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is based in Geneva, commissioned independent human rights experts to review the available evidence and to determine whether or not violations of international human rights have been committed by either Hamas or other Palestinian armed groups, as well as
Sorry,
by
Michael, sorry to interrupt.
yes.
We're not seeing the presentation in full screen. If you can go to presentation view.
Yeah, sorry. I was about to tell you.
Okay. Okay, let me try again. I'm sorry about that. I go to share screen and then I go to screen
Normally,
one.
normally when you open the PowerPoint, you have the option full screen. Like,
Is it working now? No.
It should be in the bottom right corner, I think, the presentation view.
You can go to slideshow and start.
Okay. Okay.
Michael, you can share the screen as you were doing before,
Yeah.
and then start the share screen. I guide you.
Okay. I've pressed share screen. My apologies. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Start sharing, please. Okay. Now you go on slideshow in the menu bar. Up.
Yeah.
Slideshow.
Light show. Okay.
You go there, slideshow, and start.
Okay. I'm sorry. I don't see it on my screen.
Okay. Do you like to share it from the version we have?
I've sent you.
Yeah. Yes. We can do. We can do in that case.
Okay.
Just 1 second.
Okay. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now you can go. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Please go to the next screen.
We can see your full screen, and you can go.
Okay. Okay. So my apologies for that. In each of these three reports presented by the independent human rights commissions of inquiry to the UN Human Rights Council, they found that there had been serious violations of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, both by Israel and by the Palestinian armed groups in the first two of these conflicts, in 2008, 2009, and again in 2014. And they suggested, as you can see in this excerpt from the 2015 report of the 2014 war, in some cases, they said these violations may amount to war crimes. The Commission urges all those concerned to take immediate steps to ensure accountability, including the right to an effective remedy for victims. The principal problem, of course, that all three of these reports identify: the report in 2009, known as the Goldstone Report, the 2015 report, known as the Davis Report, and the report in 2019 to the Human Rights Council, was that there was an utter lack of accountability in all of these conflicts. You can see in the 2009 report, the Goldstone Report, it says that the prolonged situation of impunity has created a justice crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory, which warrants action. And again, in 2019, to date, it said the government of Israel has consistently failed to meaningfully investigate and prosecute commanders and soldiers for crimes and solutions. So now we turn to the present war on Gaza, I'm not going to go through war crimes. I'll go directly to the genocide allegations that are being have been argued late last week in front of the International Court of Justice. What is genocide? It's a very precise legal term that's embodied both in the 1948 Geneva Convention, Genocide Convention, and the 1998 Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. And you can see the definition there. But essentially what it means, it's any actions committed with intent that are intended to try to eradicate or destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, religious, or racial group. And there are any five acts would wind up constituting genocide. The three acts that are at issue in the arguments before the International Court of Justice are the killing of members of this particular group, the causing of serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, and the deliberate infliction of conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And this, we've had various cases that have attempted to try to give more refinement to the definition of genocide, including the case that was brought 5 years ago by the Gambia against Myanmar at the International Criminal Court. And it's interesting because in November 2023, a number of Western countries, Canada, my country, Great Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark brought an application in support of the case brought by the Gambia against Myanmar, and gave a very liberal definition, if you like, of genocide, which said that genocide can consist of subjecting a group of people to a subsistence diet, a systematic expulsion of this people from their homes, and the induction of essential medical services below the minimum required. So we have, on the one hand, a number of countries from the global north arguing for a liberal definition of genocide with respect to what is going on with Myanmar against the Rohingya people, and yet looking and being much more conservative in their approach when the allegations of genocide focus on Israel. The thrust of the South African case has been on the enormous death toll and injury toll in Gaza. 24,000 people now killed to date, with over 60,000 wounded or injured. As this New York Times article reports, the heaviest conventional bombing campaign in the 21st century, with, as you can see in the third paragraph there, Israel's liberal use of very large weapons in dense urban areas, including 200 US-made 2,000-ton bombs, 2,000-pound bombs that can flatten an apartment building, is surprising. And as one of the military advisors had said, it's beyond anything I've seen in my career to find an historical comparison for so many large bombs in such a small area. He said, we would have to go all the way back to Vietnam or the Second World War. Of course, what South Africa is also arguing goes to starvation and the denial of the necessities of life, the fact that hospitals in Gaza have been put out of commission, and that almost 80%, 85% of the population has been forcibly displaced. So there were, on Thursday past, 6 of the lawyers from the South African legal team made their arguments in front of the International Criminal Court. And essentially what they're arguing is 2 points. One, there are genocidal facts that are occurring, the ones that I've just mentioned to you. And second of all, there are genocidal intent, has also been made repeatedly by Israeli political and military leaders, which indicate that their aim isn't simply to try to eliminate or decapitate Hamas as a military or political force, but in fact is meant to try to either kill large numbers of Palestinians and or make living conditions so unlivable in Gaza that there's no point of returning, and hoping that most, if not all, of the 2.3 million people living in Gaza will want to leave, because there's nothing to be able to sustain a life or an economy there. And as one of the lawyers for South Africa, the Irish lawyer Blinini Gela, said, Gaza represents nothing short of a moral failure, as described by the usually circumspect International Committee of the Red Cross. Arguments, of course, were put forth on Friday of last week by Israel. Israel's main arguments were that it has a right to defend itself, and that it was Hamas, not Israel, that has committed genocide. It made also the argument, which I think was a very weak point made by Israel to the court, that South Africa has aligned itself with Hamas, and therefore what it's arguing is barely distinguishable from the rhetoric of Hamas. With respect to trying to answer the enormous civilian death toll, essentially what Israel argued was war is brutal, wars cost lives even if they're fully justified, and that Israel has done everything to mitigate civilian harm and to alleviate civilian suffering in Gaza, all of which means that there was no genocidal intent and there is no genocide in Gaza. The only genocide is what happened on October 7th. Let's keep in mind what the role of the International Court of Justice is with respect to this. It's based in The Hague. It's the highest court in the UN system. It adjudicates disputes between countries, and this has been deemed to be is being argued by South Africa as a dispute between it and Israel. The International Court of Justice has the right to be able to adjudicate disputes between countries based on claims arising out of the 1948 Genocide Convention, and that the precedent for that is obviously the Myanmar case. The International Court of Justice has heard a case 20 years ago with respect to the illegality of the wall that Israel's building in the occupied West Bank. And next month, it'll hear a separate case trying to answer a question coming from the UN General Assembly as to whether or not Israel's occupation is legal or not. And my final slide goes to describing a separate court in The Hague known as the International Criminal Court. The two courts sometimes gets mixed up. The International Court of Justice disputes or adjudicates disputes between countries. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over the Rome Statute of 1998, which deals with war crimes, crimes against humanity, wars of aggression, and genocide. And it looks to punish individuals, not countries, if they are found to have violated any one of these major crimes. In February 2021, the International Criminal Court ruled that it has jurisdiction over violations of the Rome Statute that occur on the territory of occupied Palestine, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. In the following month, in February 2021, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announced that it was launching a formal investigation into the situation in the state of Palestine. Many Palestinian human rights organizations have criticized the prosecutor, particularly the present prosecutor, Karim Khan, for moving, in their terms, like molasses on the issue of Palestine. The issue of Palestine has been in front of the International Criminal Court for 9 years, since January of 2015, and there's been extremely slow progress made on investigation of these crimes. I'll leave it there and try to answer any questions that may be asked during the Q&A. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. I see that we already have some questions in the box. So for this panel about legality and human rights, we are opening the Q&A session right now. So first of all, we have a question that was a question for Tommaso. How are the humanitarian laws supervised during the war, and how are those responsible identified? So maybe we'll start with you, and then we'll move to Michael. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. How much time do I have for this?
Like 5 minutes, if you don't mind.
All right. So yes, very briefly, of course, this is key aspect of all of any set of norms, especially international norms. So enforcement. What happens if a state or individuals violate IHL? So thanks for the participant for raising these points. I see that it was also raised by other attendees. So I would try to put it simply by saying that, well, first of all, according to IHL rules, IHL treaties, the responsibility to prevent and punish IHL violation belongs primarily to states themselves. And this connects to the inherent nature of the international law system, which is a decentralized one primarily. Of course, it's particularly tricky and challenging in this case because this goes back to the issue of Palestine statehood and or the willingness of Israeli authorities to potentially prosecute eventual violation, especially considering that appropriate steps must have been taken domestically to implement the criminal repression of IHL violation into a state domestic criminal law. So according to the law, states responsible for IHL violation must take full reparation for the loss or injury it has caused. And then there are serious violations of IHL, which are known as war crimes. States must investigate war crimes committed by their nationals or armed forces, and possibly prosecute the suspects. So IHL rules can be enforced primarily through national legal systems, but also diplomatic channels, international dispute resolutions mechanism. Another possibility is that for state to investigate other persons for war crime in their national courts, irrespective of the nationality of the offender or the place where the violation was committed, and this is called universal jurisdiction. It is important on this point to specify that the ICRC is not involved in any way in the collection of evidence for or prosecution of war crimes and may not be compelled by courts to testify in trials, but the ICRC's advisory service on IHL is available on request to support state with this process. So this monitoring and supervisory task is covered by the ICRC while it maintains its neutrality. And finally, this is a very last point also because it was touched already by Professor Link. In certain circumstances, war crimes can be investigated and prosecuted by an international court as a complement to domestic investigation and trials, including if some prerequisites are met, the International Criminal Court. And this, of course, may promote greater respect for IHL by ensuring that the most serious crimes do not go unpunished. Again, the ICRC supported states in their work to create the ICRC and consider it to be an important tool against impunity. The very last element is that the United Nations ideally can also take measures to enforce IHL, for example, with the Security Council compelling states to comply with their obligations or to establish a tribunal to investigate breaches. And this, of course, goes back to the actual functioning of the Security Council, which is beyond the limit of what I am addressing today. So I will leave it there, and thanks for the question.
Okay, thank you so much. I wondered if Michael has his own remarks about this, and also I would like to ask Michael a couple of questions about the ICJ case. I'm trying to put the questions together so you can decide where to start from.
Well, how about this then? It says, why does South Africa have legal interest in bringing this case before the ICJ?
Yeah, like I combine a couple of questions about the ICJ and South Africa, so I'll start with this.
Okay.
So does the International Court of Justice have any jurisdiction to apply any rule or simply a ceasefire until a bilateral solution can be opted? And how independent are the judges do they represent the interests of
Mhm.
their governments, and why specifically South Africa is playing here. So
Okay.
you are free to answer to, of course,
Sure.
questions.
Okay, let me try to be very efficient in answering these. So obviously a preliminary issue that the International Court of Justice has to answer, and both Israel and South Africa argue this point, is whether there is a dispute between South Africa and Israel that allows South Africa to be able to bring the issue of genocide and the request for provisional measures before the ICJ. South Africa is arguing that it raised the issue of the threat of a genocide with Israel through November and December through various diplomatic means, and that Israel didn't respond in full. And because of that, and because of the ongoing threat of a genocide, that gives South Africa the standing, the ability to bring this application to the court. Now, you may say, why South Africa is thousands and thousands of kilometers away from Gaza and from Israel. The obligations in the 1948 Geneva Genocide Convention state that every country has a duty and a responsibility to prevent genocide or genocide in the making. South Africa is arguing that as its responsibility, as its, if you like, conscience of the world, to be able to bring this as a legal standing. And that was the same argument, if you like, that was brought by the Gambia against Myanmar in the beginning of the proceedings, also in genocide 5 years ago at the International Court of Justice. So I think South Africa probably has a fairly strong case on this preliminary issue to be able to bring the application before the court. The questions you've put together also ask, what is the ICJ and how independent of them? There are 15 judges normally on the International Court of Justice. They are elected for 9-year terms in a staggered fashion by the United Nations General Assembly. And every 3 years, 5 of the judges will either retire or they can run for a second 9-year term, and then that would be the limit. Right now, we have 4 of the judges who are ending their term and are retiring by the end of January, the very beginning of February. So that's why what South Africa has brought right now isn't to prove that genocide has happened. This is a preliminary measure called provisional measures, which is the equivalent in many countries of what we would call an injunction, to ask the court to order Israel to stop the ongoing genocide. All South Africa has to prove at this particular time is that there's a plausible case for genocide. In other words, you decide now, court, that we've raised enough evidence to present a prima facie case and order that Israel has to stop all actions which are contributing to the possible genocide, and then we'll hold a trial 3 or 4 or 5 years down the road on the full issue of whether or not genocide was being committed by Israel during its attack in 2023 and 2024 on Gaza. So the court will likely make its decision on whether or not to issue South Africa's request for provisional measures by the end of this month or the very beginning of February, while the current complement of judges still hold office. Now, are they political or are they judges? Are they legal? This is obviously and primarily a legal case, and the judges will decide that on that basis. But judges are human. They hear the news. They see what the world is going on in the world, and they also probably pay attention to the countries in which they come from and what stances those countries are taking. So there will always be, I suppose, an element of political judgment in decisions made by the International Court of Justice, but it's primarily a legal court, and it will make its decision primarily on the arguments of law and facts that are in front of it.
Thank you very much. That was very precious. I wanted to ask Tommaso if he has something to add on these reflections, like if he wants to add something to the debate, even though like the topics were different. If you have any remarks, or we can continue to the next section.
No, Alba, thanks. I'm fine. Maybe just referring to the fact that at the very last slide, I don't know if the presentation will be distributed to participants or posted online somewhere, but the very last slides contain some links on websites, the ICRC website section, where a summary and overview of what I illustrated today can be found in case of interest. And my email address as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you both, Michael and Tommaso, for your intervention. And I will then move to the next part of our workshop. Now we enter the debate around sustainability and climate change. We have first an intervention by Dario Padovan from the Turin University, titled Weaponizing Nature and Dehumanizing Humans, Notes for a Political Ecology of War. Dario Padovan is a professor teaching sociology of climate change and transition theory at the University of Turin. He is the coordinator of the Center for Inter-University Research in Socio-Ecological and Sustainability Studies, and does research on sociological perspectives on energy, food, raw materials, and climate change. He's also developing new approaches on environmental and climate racism, geocapitalism, and anthropocene. So please, Dario, I'll just note that we are running 10 minutes late, so your presentation should end approximately around like 4:45 p.m. if you don't mind, just to update you about the timing.
Okay, thank you very much. I put on my timing here, so I don't go beyond what is my time. So I'm really happy to be here because I think that, thank you very much for your invitation. I think that I would like to suggest different topics discussing war, discussing what is the conflict on Gaza, and starting from the point from an approach that I call it weaponizing nature and humanizing humans. I think that the challenge to take in consideration the use of nature in the armed conflict is interesting for me because many scholars they focus only on the human part of human side of the armed conflict war. And even though this is a very crucial aspect, I think that we have to understand what is the combination of a natural, ecological, material aspect of this conflict and the warfare, and the modern warfare, and the human suffering from this kind of events. But I want to start trying to understand what is the role of war in our society, because I think it is interesting. Here, I suggest a quotation from Michel Foucault. For him, the war is the filigree of the peace, because behind the peace, the order, wealth, authority, the order, subordination, behind the state, and behind the laws is possible to perceive and rediscover a kind of primitive permanent war. I don't want to say that war is a fundamental part of our life, but I want also to underline the fact that the peace period, the capitalist peace, is not a real peace. Our feeling in a Western society, Western countries, that we lived for a long time, a long period in a peacetime. But in fact, what happened around the world is not the same, and the perception is really different. So the problem is that to promote peace, we have to know the nature of war, because what we have to do is to eradicate and remove the war from the social and natural order. And capitalism in war, I think that is a couple of categories that I think that we have to put together also, because war capitalism are always playing war around the world. It has been traversed, constituted by a multiplicity of wars, wars of class, of race, sex, of civilization, wars on nature. This is my topic, my issue, the wars on nature. On nature. And what I want to suggest is that these war conflicts are the consequences. They share these wars, the common base in which the combination of militarism and fossilism are put together. I think that the interpenetration of militarism and fossilism is the crucial core of this kind also the war that we are seeing in Gaza, but the other kind of conflict that are going to be conducted around in the other part of the planet. And militarism, because of militarism and fossilism, we think that is a couple that they need each other. Fossilism needs the military power to ensure the control over the fossil fuels, their structure, all the operations that are connected with the fossil fuel extraction and commercialization. The other one is the problem of the militarism that needs energy to like a machine to conduct and to lead the war. So I think that in this strange combination that is possible to understand as a treadmill of destruction, we have to understand also at the international level, but is the conflicts that are uprising is so quick around in this period. And also I think that this kind of alliance or combination between militarism and fossilism in some way is facing what is a threshold of a very deep transition that the climate change is asking for, because what our world is facing is asked for our society is to move beyond the fossil energy and the organization of the world around this kind of source. But in any case, there is a lot of tension that are increasing in the side of this process. The war on nature has been also it's a way concealed by the rest of military conflict, and but all the wars they are in some way neglected what is the usual nature inside this kind of conflict on the context. So we have to only to remind ourselves that much of nature is turned into plants, gunship, ballet, and that war is the nature's limits, because it undermines the possibility of transition to an ecological society that is what we need. So I think that speaking of war on nature is the right gaze that we have to, in some way, to share, to understand what is the consequences of the conflict. And mainly the conflict now we are discussing about Palestinian and Palestine and Gaza. So I want to move toward a political ecology of war because war is a social material entity, and I think that we are to take very seriously the problematic of to mix together the social destruction and the material destruction that the war is in some way causing. And this is a way to characterize the future of these territories, of these societies for the rest of their life and their activity, their capacity to survive. So from the point of view of political ecology of war, I would like to underline 4 points. That what we have to explore also at the scientific level is the environmental legacy of war, the links between natural resources conflict and how ecological crisis feed the condition for armed conflict, how nature can be used in conflict, is military use, the environmental dimension of modern warfare, and how wars can backfire in the degradation stage of entire socio-ecological system, weaponizing nature. Here, I think my idea is that my topic is that nature is used like a weapon. Critical research are used to plan and carry out war. It means that the nature and the natural resources are used to weaken the adversary, to fortify allies. It is not only the conflict. I think that is a crucial idea, the fact that water, food, energy, transport, infrastructure, material infrastructure, all this kind of resources are in some way bent to the needs of war. Because the problem is to play a war, to wage a war, means that we have to use all the instruments, the tools that we need to destroy the enemy. So these weaponized resources are used against civilians, territories, infrastructure, is used to sustain the predatory also economic behavior of violence of many governments. So I think that the idea that natural resources are in some is becoming, like in the past in part, but now the quantity of the dimension is very, very huge. Is the problem that natural resources becoming also an instrument to make people die. And what is happening, for example, in Gaza, is the fact that the Israel siege of Gaza is the generalized destruction of civil, technical, and natural infrastructure that undergo a process of weaponization, becoming a combat weapon. So the problem is the fact that using food, using the shortage of food, of energy, of medicine is a way to destroy a population. I think also that the weaponization of nature, the destruction of nature is also a way to dehumanizing humans. So when you think what is the definition of dehumanization, it refers to the tendency to regard members of some groups as less human and thus less worthy of human treatment than member of other group. Is just what is happening in Gaza. So destroying natural habitat means dehumanizing their inhabitants. This military operation of Israel is the demonstration, I say many of our colleagues, the speakers before, that is the way in which a state is operating beyond the law, like an outlaw. So, what is the goals of the aim of Israel? I think is the deliberate render unfit for future living and the Gaza Strip. So the Israel is doing that, saying that we are fighting human animals. So I think that there is a stronger connection between weaponization of nature and dehumanization of humans. So here is ecology natural and necro-capitalism. I think that there is a connection also, and a change of character, of feature, also of the global capitalism of this kind of war, where the problem, the moral challenges that is put on the table is the dehumanization of the entire population. It is strictly linked to the this necro-capitalism has been defined by many, so it means a destructive tendency that characterizes the machine of production and the exploitation of this time. And it reinforces authoritarian tendency. And it enables the perception of the other as the absolute enemy to be fought and eliminated. I think that is a strong change in the profile of capital operation at the global level. I just two insight about energy and water. It is an interesting map because it shows that how in front of Israel, in front of Gaza, there is a basin or gas basin called the Leviathan. And the Leviathan basin is what is the thing is at the stake for the conflict in part, I think. Also because of in front of the Gaza Strip, there is the basin called is a part of this very huge Leviathan basin, Gaza Marine. It means millions of gas meters that are available for the future. And you know that Israel recently make a lot of agreement with Turkey, with Egypt, because Israel wants to become a hub of gas for the future. And I think my time is finished, but only to show that this is how energy enter conflicts. Energy system and objective in conflict, a means in conflict, and a cause of conflict. And this is the problem of water. I would like to speak about that, but we don't get time no more. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dario, for sticking to the time. And it was a very, very interesting presentation. So I invite the people watching to start asking questions in the Q&A box so that we can have a nice debate right after. And now it is the turn to listen to Sahba that gave us her introduction in the beginning. So Sahba El Shawa from IUSS Pavia is a PhD candidate in the third year of the PhD SDC program and an interdisciplinary researcher in space and sustainability. She's the founder of the Jordan Space Research Initiative and the Palestine Space Institute, as well as the co-lead of the Ethics and Human Rights in Space for Climate Action groups in the Space Generation Advisory Council in support of the United Nations Program on Space Applications. She's committed to creating a more ethical and sustainable future, both on Earth and in space. And her presentation title is The Siege on Sustainability in Gaza, Greenwashing Colonialism and Eco-Apartheid. Thank you, Sahba.
Thank you, Alba. So hello again, everyone. This presentation will be focused on presenting some important terms and facts about especially greenwashing of Israeli actions in Palestine and the concept of eco-apartheid, and then focusing more on how the siege in Gaza and the current assault on Gaza impact sustainability. I first wanted to talk about nature and resistance. The picture that you saw on the title slide was taken in 2005. It's of a Palestinian woman called Mahfouza Shtaya, who was photographed crying as she hugged a mutilated olive tree in the West Bank to protect it from Israeli settlers, who in turn are protected by the Israeli army as they destroy Palestinian land. This heartbreaking image soon became an iconic symbol for the connection between indigenous Palestinians and their homeland. A few years later, in an interview, Mahfouza said, "I hugged the olive tree. It was precious to me. I felt like I was hugging my child. I had raised the tree like my child, and we will keep resisting until the world ends." Another example I wanted to highlight was nature as resistance. In 2013, a Palestinian woman, Sabiha Abu Rahma, planted a garden of flowers inside tear gas canisters in the West Bank. These were collected by Palestinians over years of clashes with Israeli forces, often during nonviolent protests. She created this garden as a form of peaceful resistance and also as a memorial for her son, Bassem Abu Rahma, who was a protest leader, killed in 2009 when Israeli forces shot him in the chest with a tear gas grenade. This brings me to the concept of Palestinian auna, which is described by environmental researcher Ghada Sasa as collaboration. Auna recognizes that due to our deep interrelatedness, individuals cannot truly prosper while even indirectly harming others or non-humans. Rather, this Palestinian concept emphasizes the importance of strong familial, communal, environmental, intergenerational, and global solidarity for the blossoming of all present and future humans and non-humans. And that is why you will often see these images, especially of Palestinian elders protecting olive trees with their lives, because to them, the olive tree is more than just a plant. It is their kin, it is part of their family, and they raise it as their own children. On the other hand, when we talk about colonialism, there is a huge element of greenwashing. So let's start with some definitions. Greenwashing is the dissemination of false or deceptive information regarding environmental strategies, goals, motivations, and actions. And colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. Colonialism, as we know, has had a very long history of devastating indigenous populations and their environments. And despite the fact that the indigenous populations protect most of the world's wildlife and biodiversity, they are left with the least amount of land due to the colonization that occurs. And the settler colonial project of Zionism is no different. There's a common Zionist talking point where they say that they made the desert bloom. This complements the terra nullius myth, or nobody's land. According to these colonists, even if some native people did exist on that land, they were not worthy of the land that they inhabited. They are framed as having lacked the technological means or the ability to make the land thrive. And regrettably, this Orientalist narrative is very often repeated by Israel's supporters, including the current president of the EU Commission. And so it is a very pervasive lie that is told to justify the colonization of Palestine. So let's debunk this myth. First of all, when they say that they made the desert bloom, what that does not take into account is that the vast majority of actually cultivated agricultural land in current Israel or occupied Palestine was already being cultivated by Palestinians before their ethnic cleansing. After 1948, 90% of Israeli forests were established, and 89% of the plants in these forests are non-native species. Israel has uprooted a large number of native trees, including carob and fruit varieties, as well as over 800,000 olive trees, and especially since 1967. In their place, Israel has planted many non-native evergreens, such as pine trees, which negatively impact both the local ecosystems and the communities. The motivation behind this was to make the landscape more European, or civilized, but also to conceal the ruins of demolished Palestinian villages, on top of which many of Israel's nature parks are built. In 2010, there was a severe wildfire, which highlighted that such highly flammable species such as pine trees are ill-suited to the Palestinian climate. Not to mention that the cultivation of these non-native plants also requires excessive water usage, which strains resources in an area that's already suffering from water scarcity. That brings me to eco-apartheid. As we know, apartheid was first used to describe the system of racial segregation and subjugation of the African population in South Africa by white settlers. However, in 2022, Amnesty International released a report accusing Israel of apartheid. The Secretary General stated, Palestinians are treated as an inferior racial group and systematically deprived of their rights. We found that Israel's cruel policies of segregation, dispossession, and exclusion across all territories under its control clearly amount to apartheid. However, these racially discriminatory laws and systemic dispossession are not the only aspect of Israeli apartheid. It also weaponizes the environment, as we saw in the previous presentation, and it does that to maintain a system of oppression against Palestinians. And that is where eco-apartheid comes in. This is a form of institutional racism that commits environmental abuse in order to marginalize a racially defined group. According to the UNDP, so pervasive are the effects of the Israeli occupation on the climate vulnerability of Palestinian communities that the occupation in and of itself is considered a risk alongside environmental risks such as sea level rise and altered rainfall patterns. Some examples of how it implements eco-apartheid include Israel's theft of Palestinian water, which exacerbates water scarcity, its theft of Palestinian land, the destruction of Palestinian trees and agricultural land, the environmental destruction caused by Israel's illegal settlement enterprise, which is illegal under international law, and the impact of pollution due to these settlements on the Palestinian health and environment. In 2017, B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, said that Israel's environmental policy in the West Bank, including situating polluting waste treatment facilities there, is part of the policy of dispossession and annexation it has practiced in the West Bank for the past 50 years. Approximately 96.4% of Israel's electricity production comes from fossil fuels, including natural gas extracted from stolen Palestinian land. And as the previous presentation mentioned, this is currently also playing out on the coast of Gaza, where there are large amounts of natural gas, and Israel, a few days into this current assault on Gaza, announced that it had given contracts to energy companies, including European companies, to extract this gas, which is also stolen from Palestinians. Finally, the environmental impact of Israel's West Bank wall, which is also known as the apartheid wall. 85% of this wall has been built on Palestinian land, taking up 10% of the West Bank and carving up Palestinian communities, cutting off farmers from their lands and harming local ecosystems. That brings me to the siege on sustainability in Gaza. So we've seen how the Israeli occupation and their policies enforce the system of eco-apartheid on Palestinians as a whole, but this is especially dire in Gaza. A siege is a military operation in which forces surround a town or building, cutting off essential supplies with the aim of compelling those inside to surrender. Along with the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Gaza has been under Israeli military occupation since 1967. And since 2007, Israel has imposed a crippling siege and a naval blockade on Palestinians in Gaza. This has been condemned by human rights organizations and the UN as illegal collective punishment. This siege means that Israel controls everything that goes in and out of Gaza, including humans, through air, land, and water. The naval blockade is essentially a siege on the sea in Gaza, where even fishermen are not allowed to fish past a certain nautical mile. And if they go past that, they get shot by the Israeli forces. Israel's occupation and blockade have created an environmental health disaster in Gaza. 97% of the water in Gaza is unfit for human consumption by World Health Organization standards, and this is mainly due to damages caused by Israel's military operations. Even while Israel was engaging in the peace processes in the 1990s, their bulldozers systematically destroyed orange and olive groves along the fence with Gaza. It has enforced a buffer zone that extends up to 300 meters along the fence, which has left most of Gaza's agricultural lands inaccessible to Palestinian farmers. Additionally, in 2019, forensic architecture showed that not only do they regularly bulldoze and clear agricultural and residential lands, but they also complement this with unannounced aerial spraying of crop-killing herbicides. According to the World Health Organization, some of the herbicides that the Israeli military sprays to kill the crops surrounding Gaza are also likely to cause cancer in humans. In the past 100 days alone, Israel has deliberately cut off access to food, water, and electricity in Gaza. The air pollution has spiked, waterborne illnesses are on the rise, and even the wildlife is suffering. While people are still trapped under the rubble, many of whom can't be retrieved and have started decomposing, this is creating a serious hazard for Palestinian health in Gaza. Additionally, the improper burial and indiscriminate burial of corpses in mass graves may cause various diseases such as cholera to spread. Gaza's waste system is also destroyed, which makes it a biohazard. They are using makeshift landfills, which are overflowing with garbage and human waste. So even though the situation in Gaza was already described as unlivable, you can imagine in the past 100 days just how much more this siege on sustainability has been implemented, and how are Gazans expected to thrive or even live under such conditions. Finally, I want to talk about the impact on climate change. Israel's military-industrial complex, or MIC, is a major contributor to global pollution. It is the 10th largest weapons exporter in the world, and it contributes significantly to global air pollution and widespread ecological damage. A recent article showed that within the first 2 months of the war on Gaza, more CO2 emissions were emitted than the annual output of 20 climate-vulnerable nations. The study looked at carbon emissions from aircraft missions, tanks, vehicles, and explosives, and they found that over 99% of the 281,000 metric tons of CO2 were estimated to have been produced were attributed to Israel's military actions and the aid that it received from the United States. So when you look at this number, it is very clear that this so-called war is asymmetric, when over 99% of the impact is caused by one side. Not only is this military aggression's carbon footprint massive, but also the rebuilding efforts in Gaza after this ends are projected to emit 30 million metric tons of CO2, which is equivalent to New Zealand's annual emissions. I want to conclude by highlighting this paper that I really recommend everyone reads, and also reflecting on this idea of the military-industrial complex. As someone who is part of the space industry, which is in fact the space and defense industry, I know that most of the environmental impact the technology we work on has is due to military applications. I also know that most of the funding that governments give out, especially in the United States, goes towards so-called defense or military and security. And so I think this paper from environmental scientist David Schwartzman really calls it out quite plainly. He says that the MIC is the biggest obstacle to achieving climate security. The imperial agenda and militarization of global political economy threatens us all. Only global equity and cooperation will create the possibility of preventing catastrophic climate change. Climate security for humankind will only be achieved with the end of the Israeli blockade of Gaza, termination of the Israeli apartheid regime, and the full realization of the individual and collective rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much to Sahba and Dario for their presentations that actually had a lot of reactions in the Q&A section. I'm trying to put a couple of questions together because I see some interesting thoughts that can be relevant actually for both your presentations. So maybe we can start with Dario and then move on to Sahba as well. So many people are wondering if there is actually a geographical future, let's say, for Gaza. Is it, can we expect that the ongoing destruction of the environment in Gaza becomes irreversible, so making it impossible to rebuild, so becoming sort of a moon landscape? And then so the issue of Gaza as a place where it's impossible to live anymore is asked, and also an interesting question about the difference among regions with delicate ecosystem from other in our mitigation strategies. For example, can Gaza be considered a delicate region regarding the ecosystem because of limited resources, population density, or environmental stress factors? And should we have then some sort of a multi-level strategy going from light actions to more severe actions according to the region, in your opinion?
Thank you very much for the question. Very complicated. I don't know how to. The rebuilding of the habitat of Gaza, I think, from the natural point of view, I think is tens of years to rebuild our wildlife, wild nature, trees destroyed, and so on, because it is the time of nature. From the point of view of infrastructure, it depends on who is going there to rebuild, because this is the problem of Palestinians. They stay there, as we hope. Is the problem is how to recreate resources to do that, or on the other side, the problem is the complete displacement. Maybe it arrests, like you said, desert, no, there. And regarding the other kind of question, and I think also is interesting. What is from the point of view of necro-capitalism? I think that some question try to understand what is the global scenarios in which this conflict is blew up. And I think it is interesting asking ourselves what is the reason of this aggression, so so cruel and destroying an entire community. And I think that the problem now that our global relationships, they are, and the states, national states, and the global state, the empire, we can say also, is facing now the global level is a really deep challenge. A deep challenge coming from climate change, a deep challenge coming from the chaotic order and the multipolar order, we can say that at the international level. And I think that this is putting UK, West, UK media and the Western in its totality is putting out discomfort because they don't know how to act in this situation. They think that they are challenged in their hegemony, cultural hegemony. I say very well, Saba. The problem of the colonization of the land in Palestine is to reproduce a Western industrial model of agriculture for the exportation. This is, I think, the model that is applied to agriculture, is applied to management of water, is applied to management of energy. The problem is the appropriation, destruction of these resources to be commodified. To be commodified beyond what is the culture, the habitus of the people that are using this kind of resources. I think that is the principle behind this conflict. And the problem is that the laws they are losing, or what is happening? The state are losing a moral commitment. They are more feeling against nature and many against the humans. So I think it is a combination of different factors. When I underline, I stop here, the combination, the interlinking between the fossilism and militarism, I think that it is the core problem that we have to face in some way.
Thank you so much, Dario. And maybe, Saba, you want to comment on what was previously asked?
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects to the question. This idea that can it be rebuilt and will it be rebuilt? And the other is, how do we actually care for this environment? In terms of the first one, I think that it's important to bear in mind that also, as I presented, even before the current situation in Gaza, it was already described as unlivable. Palestinians in Gaza are not going to leave their homes. Palestinians have learned time and time again that when they leave, they are not allowed to come back. And the majority of the population in Gaza are already refugees from other parts of Palestine who are forced into the Gaza Strip. And now they're all being forcefully displaced to the south of Gaza. And, one of the plans also, as Dario mentioned, is to put them in the desert. I think this is a very cynical kind of way of thinking that this will only end after Israel has successfully forcibly displaced the Palestinians in Gaza. I think that Palestinians in Gaza do not want to leave their home. They want to rebuild. They've done it many times over the years. There have been various assaults on Gaza, and every time they do rebuild it, and it's not easy. And there's a lot of trauma and impacts that they are left with. But it is something that I believe should not be their responsibility alone. Israel, as the perpetrator of the current situation in Gaza, has the moral and perhaps even the legal obligation as the occupying power to repair the damage that it has done, first of all. And I think the solution to a lot of the environmental problems, it's not unique to Palestine. This is something that we see everywhere around the world, where indigenous populations who actually understand the environment, they understand how to take care of it, they are stewards of the environment, are stripped away of their land. And so the solution is always going to be land back. We are not going to solve the climate crisis so long as we are imposing Western views on what environmentalism is without giving indigenous people the right and the ability to actually care for this land the way that it's supposed to.
Thank you so much, Saba. And so we are going to switch to the second part of the workshop, and the moderator will be from now on Silvia Maritano. She will be the moderator for the debate around the role of academia. Silvia is a PhD candidate in her third year of the PhD SDC program with a background in medicine. Her current research focuses on the relationship between climate change and child health from a mitigation perspective, oriented towards the pursuits of climate and health co-benefits. Sylvia is also an elected student representative in the PhD SDC program. Thank you very much, Sylvia, and welcome.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Alba, for introducing me and for moderating this workshop so far. And we've been through a lot of presentation, which covered a multitude of interesting information and concepts, which has been extremely interesting, but listening and learning about the current situation in Gaza might have felt a bit overwhelming. So we'll try now to practically give some insight, and I'm now welcoming you to this final section of the workshop, and the one that will also require a bit of your involvement in the discussion, and which will give us hopefully also some insights on what our role could be as scientists and academics, besides witnessing from afar those atrocities that Palestinians are now facing. And now I have the honor to host and present Professor Paola Rivetti. Paola Rivetti is an associate professor in politics and international relations at the School of Law and Government of the Dublin City University. She's a council member of the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies, a member of the mentorship committee for the Association for Iranian Studies, and of the Committee for Academic Freedom of the Italian Society for Middle East Studies, SISAMO. She is also the former representative for scholars at risk at her institution, and she researches the government of society and politics in the Middle East and North Africa from a comparative perspective, with a specific focus on Iran, social and political mobilization, gender, and politics. Paola's presentation title is Reflection in the Role of Academia and Academic Freedom. And thank you, Paola, for being here. I leave the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, for the very nice introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thanks for having me. In particular, thanks to Sahba, Elena, who have been also discussing with me about the presentation, and of course Sylvia for leading this section. So what I would like to do now is, for the next quarter of an hour or so, introduce a couple of points that I see as important when it comes to academic freedom. And I would like to thank the speakers who preceded me, and I couldn't attend the previous sections. Today is the first day of term here, but I think it's really important. The kind of contextualization you've given is really fundamental, because what we are when we talk about academic freedom, we're not talking about something abstract or something that universities do not exist on the moon, while the rest of us live here on planet Earth. The state of academic freedom, violations of academic freedom, or respect, or what is respectable, what is what we are allowed to say and what we are not allowed to say, of course, depends on very material relations of power, which are entrenched in what you have been discussing so far, and also in the egregious imbalance of power that we have in front of us, the results of which we have in front of us. So my goal is, I think academia has a role to play. I think academic freedom as a concept, and even as a legal norm, can help us in kind of creating a space for political action and political participation towards justice for all. But we should not romanticize it, in the sense that exactly like any other liberal norm or any other norm in liberal legislation, of course, academic freedom, has a number of has a degree of abstraction and has a number of, lives in a world of contradiction as such. We should not romanticize it. I should say that an egregious book that I think everyone should read, regardless of what you think about BDS, which is, as you know, the Boycott, Sanctioned, Invest campaign against Israel, which started in 2005, called by 500 between civil society organizations and other social organizations in Palestine. So regardless of what your position is on BDS, I think that really great book on academic freedom and also on BDS is Nick Reamer's book title, which was out earlier this year, perhaps in 2022, titled The Boycott Theory, sorry. So I think Reamer, who's a colleague who's based at the University of Sydney in Australia, in that book really sets out and lays out some really crucial theoretical reflections on, on academic freedom, approaching it from a critical perspective and kind of, providing arguments, for a more materialistic defense of, the space for political participation and freedom of expression specifically within universities. But at the same time, the book, Nick Reamer in his book also offers a number of, very good points to reflect on why we should still uphold this, this principle with the awareness of its limitation. And I think the situation that we have been witnessing in several national contexts in Europe, in North America, of course, in Israel, are a good offer some good examples of why I think we should uphold the principle of academic freedom. So before I go into into giving you a picture of what has been happening, I think that another very important aspect of how how universities and society more generally have been restricting liberal freedoms, such as freedom of opinion, freedom of thought, freedom of expressing those opinion publicly, whether on the press or in the classroom. I think that it is important to also emphasize the distance that I think is really significant. So the significant distance that we have been seeing between the kind of institutional reaction to the attacks on October the 7th and the following, counterattacks, let's put it this way, or the following war on Gaza, on the one side, and on the other side, again, focusing on academias and universities, the counter reaction to this institutional reluctance to extend solidarity and extend solidarity to everyone. The counter reaction that we have seen coming from colleagues, but especially students. So if we look at Italy, with all the the very important limitations that generally speaking political action has today within and outside of universities, but we have seen a number of student organizations occupying universities, extending solidarity to the Palestinians, and actually taking on, if you want, that kind of progressive role that we often associate the university to. So I think this distance between you know what institutional representatives have been saying. I don't know if you remember the you know, I think it was the very first declaration, but by the CRUI, which is the conference of the Italian of the presidents of Italian universities. So the very first statement by the CRUI, it was this very interesting linguistic and narrative exercise, all geared toward not mentioning and not writing down the word Palestinians. So I think that the counter, the reaction to this, as I said before, reluctance, to take action, to express solidarity on the campuses is important, and is, of course, a mirror of a larger dynamic and the larger process that we are seeing in our societies when it comes to the distance between the ruling elite and and the population, or at least the opinions that the population that has been activating on this issue has been expressing. When it comes to what has been happening on different campuses in the past few months since October the 7th, I think has been quite serious. It's been and in some cases is extremely worrisome. So we know of colleagues who have been suspended, if not directly fired, who are currently under investigation for expressing solidarity with the Palestinian population. We know of cases in the UK where the university has called the police on some colleagues on the on preoccupation that university authorities had in regards to the content that some colleagues were writing on social media, which speaks to a dynamic that is much older than October the 7th when it comes to pro-Palestinian or solidarity driven activism on campus or outside of campus. We know that there's a record story. There's a story of criminalization. There's a story of this being contained and limited. But of course, after, Hamas attacks on October the 7th, of course, this dynamic has been accelerated, and the situation in a way precipitated towards a further securitization of university campuses, of classrooms as well. So in a way, and we have seen this, especially in places like the UK, where you would have, PREVENT, which is the anti-radicalization and, prevention of terrorism and prevention of radicalization program, which is a policy package, right? Being implemented directly on campuses as well. I mean, colleagues in the UK have been mobilizing against PREVENT for a while now, especially because PREVENT asks that colleagues report students who have according to some criteria suspicious behaviors, or do suspicious readings, for instance. So there is a story of, especially UK campuses being, securitized in that sense, and colleagues mobilizing against that. But we are seeing, the same process also going on in other environments in different ways. Of course, these are not necessarily new ways. There's always, security or securitizing practices always have a story. Of course, they do not come out of the blue, but if you think of, one famous example of the kind of freedom that police forces enjoy today has been the attack on the campus of the University of Turin in northern Italy just last month, where a colleague was also beaten up by the police forces. So I also mentioned, so there's not only this dynamic of police forces intervening directly, but there's also a dynamic of, restriction of the freedom to speak and the freedom to actually entertain debates and entertain discussions. So I'm speaking to you from Ireland, from Dublin, Ireland. This is probably, Europe. I mean, at the level, Europe-wise, is probably one of the safest place. But my colleagues in Germany, my colleagues in Switzerland do not feel they have the same freedom, do not feel as safe as I feel in, for instance, canceling classes and having debates with students, okay, about what's going on in Gaza. So hence the investigations, hence the suspensions of many colleagues. As Committee for Academic Freedom of the Italian Society of Middle Eastern Studies, we are, for instance, closely working with some colleagues in Switzerland who have been suspended and fired. The UK is another place where the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies and the the Committee for Academic Freedom of the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies has been, doing a lot of work. North America is the same. If you click on, if you double check out the links, I've been actually, Silvia, thank you very much, Silvia, for doing that, has been sharing with you. You have the links to all these different committees for academic freedom, and you can see the work they have been doing, which is really substantial. So my last point, talking about restrictions of freedom of speech, restrictions of the ability of entertaining and having actually discussions, and the restriction on a function that university have been praising themselves with, historically speaking. So, and that's the fact of being, venues for forming and shaping opinions based on facts, information in a rather free and safe environment. So speaking about limitation to all this, it's impossible not to mention the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I think it's important to mention, you probably, all of you might be familiar with it, but I think in Italy there's a lot of disinformation about this. The operational definition of anti-Semitism that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance has come up with in 2016 is a definition of anti-Semitism, which includes different examples of how racism against Jewish and Semitic people is manifests. Some of these examples are problematic from our point of view, because they do equate criticism of the policies of the State of Israel with, anti-Semitism. So this is the core problem with IHRA, which has been, adopted in a number of places in Europe. So 75% of universities have adopted the IHRA definition in the UK. So one of the links Silvia has kindly shared with you is a link to an event we as BRISMES, so as British Society for Middle Eastern Studies, organized with the ELSC, which is the European Legal Support Center, an organization of lawyers based in Amsterdam, whose job is basically providing legal assistance to those who kind of get in trouble, whose work is being criminalized for being pro-Palestinian. So the LSE the LSC and BRISMES have issued a report on how the definition of the IHRA and the adoption of it by the university has had a very negative direct impact on academic freedom of colleagues. When it comes to Italy, the adoption is different. So the only the pattern of adoption is different. The only university that adopted the IHRA definition is the University of Pisa. But so no other university has directly adopted it, but the IHRA has been adopted by the Council of Ministers, and the CRUI, the Conference of Italian University Presidents, has suggested its adoption to single universities. So this might happen. We hope not, but given the current atmosphere and giving, if you pay attention to the public debate, how anti-Semitism is being talked about in the public discourse in Italy, it seems that all this public discourse is preparing the ground for a very for an adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. But even though we do only have one university that directly adopted it, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, because of its adoption by the Council of Ministers, Consiglio dei Ministri, it informs all, for instance, police textbooks. So the textbooks that police forces utilizes, when you go to the police school academy for studying. So it directly has a bearing on and an influence on how certain activities are being criminalized. It's been adopted by the journalists corporation in the region of Lazio, but it would probably next be adopted by the Italian Corporation of Journalists. So what we are looking at in the future, what is waiting us, for us, ahead of us, is an era where we would probably witness further restriction and further limitation. So it's of utmost importance that we start strategizing for not only for self-defense, but also for imagining and kind of refining our political imagination to come up with good counter arguments and being able to defend our the political space that we have for also doing our job, because it might really goes down to also criminalization of our own research activities. So to conclude, please do connect with us if you are having problems, if you're experiencing, limitation of your academic freedom. We would be, delighted to hear from you, not because we are delighted, about you needing us, but we are also trying to map out what's happening. So I'm gonna stop here and I'm gonna handle it back to Silvia. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola, for sharing with us your experience and also all the important resources we put in the chat. Now to conclude, we are running a bit late. We are 10 minutes ahead of the schedule, but I would invite you to stay 5 to 10 minutes longer, because we prepared a couple of questions that would be launched as poll, and to try to involve you in this discussion and try to make it a bit active. And I will launch them while commenting them along with Paola, making her some questions. So we created those questions starting from an article by Steve Salaita, an American scholar, writer, and public speaker that faced some controversy over his criticism of Israel since its bombardment of Gaza in 2014. We will share in the chat the article that inspired us with those questions. So I'm launching the first question, and I invite you to answer. So the first question is, do you believe that Western academics in Europe and North America can effectively contribute to addressing the situation in Gaza? And well, I'm also asking this to Paula, also because sometimes we might feel helpless in assisting those atrocities, but how much power do we think that those institutions have in intervening and also modifying the ongoing situation?
Thanks, Silvia. The feeling of powerlessness is something that is very hard to escape these days. I think it's very important to make space for this in the classroom as well. So if you're involved in teaching activities, even, you know, as part-time lecturers, or you just have seminars to teach to students, I would suggest that you actively include this as part of your, of your classroom activity. So the first question, I think, also speaks to the question that Mohammed is asking in the Q&A. So it's we all feel powerless, but I do not I mean, we have some personal, everyone has some personal, strategies. Personally, I think I would, I think that my depression would, significantly worsen if I weren't involved in, supporting colleagues on a very personal level. What we do as committees for academic freedom is, for instance, writing letters in support of South Africa. In these days, South Africa proposals to, to the ICJ, or, writing to relevant authorities in asking them to take action or not take action on, specific cases. I do think that there's force there. There might not be force in the sense of, our action directly resulting into a change of policy at the national or international level. Of course, that doesn't happen. But at the same time, Noura Rakat very clearly states it in her book, Justice for Some, that between, this kind of binary positions, where on the one side we have those who believe that the international law and, international organization will solve everything on one side, and on the other side, those who are totally hopeless about the ability of international organization to address, injustice and fix it. There's another option, which is the one that Noura is actually, supporting and arguing for, which is international law and intergovernmental organization are effective if there's a movement. If there's grassroots mobilization, supporting them. It might think of how long it took to even to, huge international campaigns to end the apartheid regime in South Africa. So of course, these are long term. In the meantime, of course, there are, in the meantime, it's painful because, we are looking and having access to, to the reality of what's going on in Gaza through social media. And of course, we would like to be able to act at the moment, to kind of help. I can share, I think we can do something very practical, like if you can, apply for the Erasmus Plus International Mobility Scheme. It's a very simple scheme. You can invite colleagues, you can invite students to your university. It's an extremely simple, simple application that you can do. So that's a way, very practical way to help people. But I would say, do not stop mobilizing.
All right, thank you. I will stop this first poll and I will share the result. And well, apart from this sense of hopelessness, as you said, there's still some belief that we could do something. At least this long-term view is very effective, and in the meantime, also given the urgency of the matter and the fast pace at which these atrocities are going on, at least we can try to show our support to Palestinian people and with events like these and with activism. Well, The second, and okay, I will stop sharing these. We have two more questions. The first refers a bit to what you mentioned before, and is, should Western academic institutions boycott Israeli university and divest from Zionist entities to oppose the situation in Gaza? And so you mentioned before the boycott, divestment, and sanction strategies. And could you summarize a bit in a nutshell, like giving some insight of what it is about and what its potential, but also what its threats are?
Of course. So yeah, so I already gave a couple of information there about the BDS. You probably have seen news. It's yesterday's news. So Pope Francesco, rejected this big donation by the Leonardo Foundation, which is the semi-private, semi-public, actually, Italian foundation that trades in, war technology, basically. So the Vatican, said that they are not taking, Leonardo's money and that donation was aimed at one of the hospitals in Rome. So BDS doesn't work in a very different way, in the sense that it is, it is predicated on the ethical position of, of saying no, basically, of taking, having the freedom and the right to say no. One important thing that I should mention is that BDS is not a boycott of, this is often thought, and it's wrong. It's not a boycott of colleagues, right? So it's not a boycott. It's not like you can't invite your colleague over to give a talk to your class, or people often think that it's also about not writing or publishing something together. It's an institutional boycott. So it involves actions such as saying no to inter-university agreements, joint funding applications if Israeli universities are involved as institutions. This is very important. It focuses on, at the institutional level. So this is why I was, talking about Nick Reamer's book earlier, because it's, it is a book about BDS. It is a book about how can we theorize about academic freedom from the point of view of something that really feels like it is against academic freedom, because you're saying no to collaboration. So Reamer very much normalizes this idea of saying no. I mean, think of what has been happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? So we have seen this very, all universities very quickly reverting their policies to boycotting not only institutionally Russian institutions, but this also mounted to personal individual boycotts a lot of times. So the idea that boycotts are something that is stranger to the history of academic freedom, or something that actually is an obstacle to academic exchange is should be put in context of the institutional boycott, but also in the context of what other academic freedom, the academic freedom of who you are enabling by, for instance, struggling against universities in settlements, for instance, right? So I mean, if we accept the idea that instead of an Israeli university, there should be a Palestinian university, then we are working and protecting the academic freedom of Palestinian students and Palestinian colleagues.
All right. Thank you for this insight. Also, this question was a bit more complicated, as you said, and a bit more, let's say, tricky also to answer and to take position. So most people, like the people were divided between yes and no, which they think is not the right approach. But thank you for sharing us the resources to look at. And I invite again all the attendees to go and look after it. So I launched the last question. which will deal also with this academic and the. Oh, sorry. I think it was the wrong one. Yeah. This is, are you in favor of incorporating Palestinian literature and perspective into educational curricula across various disciplines? This is the question, and I wanted to go back to you with saying that first we saw and we can imagine how much recent events are affecting the cultural and linguistic and historical heritage of Palestinians. And I will go back to one question that was asked at the very beginning of this event in the Q&A section, is that how can we as students behave and play our roles to protect people of Palestine and stop genocide in Gaza? So what's our power as students? And is this incorporation of Palestinian literature and perspective one thing that we can do to address this issue?
Yeah, I think so. I think I think there's a lot of benefits to incorporate Palestinian literature and perspectives, not only as an ethical, as an ethical point of making a point about the centrality of Palestinian voices, but I think also because it does a lot of good work in deconstructing this idea that, the Middle East is somewhere there, non-affected or fundamentally stranger to world history, which is not the case. I think that, as students, you could ask for more, of Palestinian theory, political theory, Palestinian political thought, Palestinian literature, perspective, and so forth and so on, to be brought to you by your lecturers. Sometimes, sometimes we are so busy with so many. I'm totally, aware that lecturers might have a hard time in finding the time to revise their their syllabuses and their curricula. It's between administration, writing, and blah blah blah. We're quite busy. But students can be a good stimulus in this sense of asking. So do ask us, what you would like to see in the classroom. Apart from this, I think that student organizations also can play a role when it comes to. I'm not really an expert in this, but so I know that, for instance, in this monstrous funding program, which is Erasmus Plus, I know that also student organizations can participate and directly apply for funding. So this is, for instance, something that that could be done in terms of having exchanges. And I should also say that when I'm talking about having exchanges or inviting Palestinian students, colleagues over, and so forth and so on, of course, I'm talking about the West Bank. There are no universities left in Gaza. In the past months, we all have lost a lot of colleagues, who have died under the bombs with their extended families. So for the moment, it's just not doable. Hopefully, someone before was talking about reconstruction. Hopefully, Gazans universities would be reconstructed, but for the West Bank is currently an increasingly dangerous place. So we also might want to think about our colleagues in the West Bank.
All right, thank you very much for all these inspiring resources and your inspiring talk. It was very nice. For the sake of time, we won't launch the last two questions, but they are very similar. And if you're interested, I remind you to the Salaitas article, so you can go through it and read a bit more. So, well, those are the results of the poll. So you see that for this last one, most of the audience is strongly or somewhat in favor of incorporating Palestinian literature and perspective into the educational curricula. So, well, thank you again, Paula. Thank you again to everyone. I think we are out of time now, and we need to close this workshop session. I would really like to thank you all for interacting, participating. Thanks to all of you that stays until the end and who took part in the discussion. We often feel that we don't know much to take part in discussion about current events, but today all the speakers managed to cover most of the roots and background we need to talk freely about the current situation in Palestine. Many thanks then to all of you, all the panelists, all the speakers, the faculty, the PhD coordinator, and of course, all the students who participated and helped in organizing these events, which is, I think it's a very nice example of activism. And it was very nice for us to get together and achieve this, which I think is a huge milestone. And well, many compliments for all of you, all of the people that were involved in this. So I think that being informed is the foundation for empowerment, and I hope that today's event, we together did a step towards a positive change. And have a nice rest of the day. This workshop will be still on the use page on the YouTube, so you are free to go there and watch it again or spread the link with other colleagues that couldn't attend today. Thank you again and have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Good evening.